Oh, so we're feeding you. All right. So enjoy that. Don't fall asleep after lunch. And have a good time. And I'm in Hume Hall if you ever have any questions. Thank you. And so I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Again, everybody, welcome. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Dr. Freeman back there in the corner is stage managing, so she's pointing at people. Mike and Brian, Dr. Collier, and Dr. Simpkins, please stand up and be recognized. Everybody, I would like you all, for those of you who don't know them, to say hello to Dr. Mike Collier, Dr. Brian Simpkins from EKU, who are hosting this event today. They are in charge of the Bluegrass Intelligence Consortium Center for Academic Excellence, of which we are a partner. And so I would like you all to give them a round of applause to thank them for this wonderful. We have somebody else here.
Joe Bottom.
I'm sorry, Joe?
Joe Bottom.
Joe Bottom. Nice to know you all.
We have also our student worker, Kim Matola, here as well.
Hi, Kim. Thank you for everything you've done. Also, I would like to acknowledge Ms. Aster Hiley, who is our division assistant, and she is, nothing happens without the assistants, and we all know that, so I need to acknowledge her. So today we are going to have a variety of activities going on. We're really excited to be hosting this workshop today. The topic of our workshop, as you all know, is taking a multidisciplinary approach to understanding radicalization, which when we selected the topic for the workshop, we didn't really realize that it was going to be as vital and as relevant as it is today. So we hope that you'll enjoy the presentations that we've got. So here's how we'll proceed through the day. After I finish up here, we will begin the day with Dr. Tom McPartland's talk, and he will be discussing the history of radicalization. And we will follow that by Dr. Will Riley, who will be talking about some of the factors that are political and social factors involved in radicalization and extremism, followed by Dr. John Sharp, who will be talking about profiling, and then I'll follow up with a discussion of propaganda. So we will do, we'll break for lunch at 11:30, I believe is what we've got scheduled. And we will do a kind of a working lunch. Our students will be staffing the posters that you see back there along the wall as we're going out to lunch, and then they'll kind of rotate in and out so that they'll get a chance to eat as well. Following that, we'll finish up our talks in the afternoon. There will be a question and answer session, so the speakers will have a bit of a panel where if you have specific questions that you think about during the day, you're welcome to ask us. Also, please feel free to ask questions during the presentations. We will break for refreshments at 2 o'clock, and then we will begin work on our workshop activity, during which you'll apply everything that you learned here today to creating a propaganda campaign for a political or an activist organization. So I hope you'll enjoy all, nice catch, Ivan. I hope you'll enjoy all the events that we have planned for today. I hope our posters all stay up there on the wall. And so welcome everybody to Kentucky State University, and we'll go ahead and begin with our speakers. One of the problems that I have right now is that my computer will not open Word, and I had some nice speaker bios that were all put together. Unfortunately, I can't get to those bios, so let me just introduce to you Dr. Tom McPartland, and I'm going to ask him to do his own brief bio and tell us a little bit about who he is and what he does while I get the PowerPoints up and running. So, Dr. McPartland. Yours is over here, it should be fine. It's just my computer that's acting out.
Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. Actually, I retired last summer, so I'm happy to come back. A little more rested than I was before. My background is I had a PhD in intellectual history, and I was director of the honors program here for years, and that was multidisciplinary. I taught courses in a variety of fields. My specialty is mainly history and philosophy, but I've taught courses on the history of revolution. The last course I taught here last spring was the history of revolutions in ISIS. Unfortunately, it's still relevant. I published for about 20 years. I've been attending the American Political Science Association and giving presentations. I have a chapter in a book on revolutions on the subject I'm going to talk about in a few moments. So I do have a background in this area, and I do want to give you a broad historical perspective in half an hour, covering the world history of revolution. So I will get the... Okay, and it should fit on one page, I think, if you can make it smaller.
It's very small. Did y'all see it when I first brought it up?
No.
If it's all on one page, it's very small. So, this is more like all right.
Well, what I want to do is give you a large-scale background on radical revolution. The ISIS movement was first described as a group of insurgents in the press, and then later and up until now they call them terrorists, and there's debate, should it be called Islamic terrorists or not. I'm going to argue that's not adequate. They're not 19th century anarchists. They're radical revolutionaries, and we have to know what that is to take them seriously. So, what do I mean by radical revolution? Let me give you an historical example. Now, if you go to the ISIS website, you'll get an idea of what radical revolution is about. Last year, one of my students in this course I taught looked at the website and was sick for 2 days afterwards. I suppose I should have put that down as an outcome for my class. Let me, though, give you another historical example of radical revolution. This happened in 1975 in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge seized the capital city of Phnom Penh. The entire population of that city was marched out into the countryside, including the lame and infirm who were dragged from hospitals. The very young and old began to fall by the wayside and die. This was only a harbinger of things to come. The new country of Kampuchea was proclaimed with its new calendar as a symbol of the new society. Relations with all governments except China were cut off. The party, led by Pol Pot, who had been trained as an engineer at the Sorbonne University of Paris, had the momentous task of completely destroying the corrupt old society and creating the society of the people. This social engineering meant the eradication of urban life, of the accoutrements of modern Western life, the postal system, currency, telephone, medicine, of the family, and of individualism. This eradication required an unrelenting war against the enemies of the people. Concretely, death to army officers, civil servants, teachers, policemen, and any others associated with the old regime, to anyone educated, to those who violated the strict new rules of behavior. So ensued a reign of torture, terror, and mass killing. While the methods were often primitive, given the assault on modern civilization, the results were effective, with the use of such implements as axe handles and such techniques as disembowelment and burying alive. Perhaps up to a quarter of the population of the country perished in the killing fields. The estimates go from several 100,000 to 2 million. The Khmer Rouge justified these drastic measures because previous attempts at revolution in Russia, China, and elsewhere were failures in their mind. Only in Kampuchea was there true revolution. Indeed, this was a revolution in the most radical sense. Now, I wish this were just fiction, but unfortunately this took place. So what do I mean by radical revolution? Let me scroll down here to the very bottom. I have a definition. As you see there, the attempt through political violence and substantial social change to transform human consciousness and human nature, eliminating the major source of evil in society. Now that's a mouthful. In fact, you might wonder, boy, there are a few psychos around like that, but it couldn't be that many. Unfortunately, this is the basis of what I call radical revolution. Now, that term has many meanings. Revolution could mean, in the general sense, some major significant historical change. The scientific revolution, the agricultural revolution. But I'm using this term in this specific sense. And unfortunately, there are a lot of historical examples. Now, let me also point out here, if you go to the top of the outline again, that most societies throughout most of human history are not in any sense revolutionary in this sense. The traditional tribal societies mediated their order by a shaman, a witch doctor, a medicine man to keep in touch with a larger cosmic order that was permanent. When you have the first civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, the Indus Valley, in Central and South America, the order of human society was in attunement with a larger cosmic divine order because of the mediation of a king. We can talk about sacral kingship, and this was the traditional order of civilization until very recently. By contrast, revolutionaries kill kings. This happened in the English Civil War in the mid-1600s. This happened in the French Revolution, and it happened somewhat recently in Ethiopia. So what is it that would make people break from the most traditional views that humans have had throughout most of human history and adopt that radical view that I just showed you at the bottom of this outline? We have to look at the sentiments behind the idea of radical revolution. The idea can change. The specifics can change. But underlying it are certain sentiments that believe that human reality can be transformed. And there usually is a spiritual meaning behind those sentiments. That God, for example, in the Israelite, Christian, and Muslim traditions, intervenes in history to change history. We find some similar ideas in certain interpretations of Taoism and even Buddhism. There has to be some belief that there can be some radical change in our human existence that can eliminate the source of evil. Now, the term revolution was first used in a substantial way by Copernicus at the beginning of the scientific revolution when he wrote a book on the revolution of the heavenly bodies. That's the original meaning of the term, revolving. But in Italy in the Middle Ages, particularly in Florence, the term revolution in Italian began to take on some meanings associated with violent political change. That meaning of the term was transformed in the Enlightenment period to mean progress and cultural revolution associated with the advance of science. The term began to have its deepest resonance in association with the French Revolution, which is arguably the most important event in modern history. And that term revolution associated with the French Revolution conveyed the notion not only of huge, massive changes of the old regime, the monarchy and the aristocracy, but the idea that this was inevitable, almost beyond human control, and that this was a transformation of human history that would lead to a new order of things. So that's the resonance of that term revolution in the modern world. Now let me say something briefly about the logic of radical revolution. Let's turn briefly to some terms from the Old Testament and New Testament that come from certain books of the Bible. The notion, for example, in the Old Testament that there's going to be a new Jerusalem, a transformation where the lion will lie with the lamb. In the book of Daniel, we have the notion after great calamity, those faithful to God, the saints, will emerge victorious. And that notion is an apocalyptic notion, that out of great disaster will come this transformation of the human world. That notion is also found in the book of Revelation in the New Testament, associated with the idea also from the book of Daniel that the reign of the saints will last 1,000 years, the millennium. Now, the logic of revolution is to go from what was the typical interpretation of those passages in the Christian Middle Ages by St. Augustine, that those passages refer to spiritual battles and the destiny of the soul in the beyond. The logic of revolution would take such passages and the sentiments behind them and interpret them literally, not metaphorically. The next stage would be to interpret them not only literally, but have the idea that we know when these events are going to happen. They're going to happen soon. But we take a prayerful, passive role, because we don't know exactly when. The next stage in the logic of revolution is to argue that we not only know these things are coming soon, but that we can play an active role in helping bringing them about, but perhaps in a peaceful way. Like in the Middle Ages, you had groups of people going from village to village, flagellating themselves, beating themselves, and demanding that people repent of their sins to prepare the way. The final step is to believe that you interpret these passages literally. You know that soon these things are happening. You're going to play an active role, and you'll play a violent role, because you bring about these changes by overthrowing the established order of things, which is irredeemably corrupt. We then have radical revolution. Now, in the Middle Ages, I'm skipping the examples. There are examples also beyond the Christian world. I can just briefly mention, in China, in the 2nd century, the Christian era, there was a group that took literally some ideas from the Taoist philosophy about the idea of a great peace, which is supposed to be an inner peace that would then spread throughout society. They call it the Taiping. But the followers of the yellow turbans, as they call themselves, believed that this was an actual period in earlier human history, and that by overthrowing the Chinese Empire, they could restore the great peace, the Taiping. And we had huge clashes of armies taking place. The Han Dynasty was eventually successful, but these ideas that went underground, secret societies, they emerged again in a different form centuries later when the Chinese reestablished their own independence from the Mongol rule, and we have the red turbans adopting these ideas and merging them with certain Buddhist ideas of the coming of a great bodhisattva, and merging these also with Zoroastrian ideas of a cosmic battle between God and Satan that was also taking place here on earth between good and evil. The red turbans were allies of the Mings, and the Mings then disassociated themselves when they gained power. But again, these ideas went underground in secret societies and emerged again in the 19th century. One of the greatest cataclysms in the 19th century, largely unknown to most people, the Taiping Rebellion, where the leader proclaimed himself incorporating Christian ideas as the brother of Jesus, who would establish these millennium and also the Taiping. Millions of people died in this upheaval. Millions of people. These sentiments later were taken up by Mao Zedong, who introduced a Western idea of revolution, Marxism, as he took over in 1949, and later had this spectacular, radical revolutionary movement, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. So I'm not going to have time to go through all of these revolutions that I've listed here. But originally, these radical revolutionary ideas were a trickle in the Middle Ages. They became greater and greater in scope during the late Middle Ages. They poured over in 1534, 1535 in the city of Münster near the border of Germany and Holland. Radical revolutionaries who then proclaimed themselves radical Anabaptists, not the ordinary peaceful Baptists, but these were people who were going to bring about the millennium. They kicked out all of the godless people from Münster, the Catholics and Lutherans. proclaimed the new Jerusalem and the dawn of the millennium. They established an entirely new society. They established polygamy and communism. Anyone who was a sinner would be executed. That is, anybody who didn't go along with polygamy and communism, among other things. So we had a reign of terror. They sent out missionaries to Amsterdam and other cities to spread the revolution. Now, they were rather easily put down eventually, but they give us in one small city a prototype of all future revolutions, including the reign of terror and the establishment of an entirely new society. So they're not just responding to injustices, and there were injustices in that area. There were plagues, there was a threat of invasion from the Turks, you had a ready-made apocalyptic situation. But they wanted to transform that into this radical new society and eliminate the source of evil in society by killing the evil people, the enemies of the people. A century later, such ideas were prominent in the English Civil War as the Puritans overthrew the monarchy. But the radicals didn't quite seize power. A century later, the radical sentiments of revolution were slowly passed over to secular ideas. During the French Revolution, the radical Jacobins seized power and wanted to implement their idea of Rousseau's notion of a republic of virtue. Originally, that terror, as they called it, was in response to circumstances, rebellion throughout the countryside against the new regime, invasion by Austria and Prussia. But when they put down these threats, the terror didn't decrease, it increased. I call this the terror of ideology. The enemies of the people had to be destroyed to bring about Rousseau's Republic of Virtue. The red flag of revolution was raised in the middle of the 19th century to transform the idea of revolution to that of communism, which would establish the new society, and we see a communist regime emerging for the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution. And we see a number of other revolutions I've listed here, all of which are communist in sentiment, some more radical than others. I've mentioned the Cambodian Revolution in the beginning of this talk. So I'm just listing them here without going into the details. We could say that I'm having trouble here scrolling. Let me just summarize by saying by the mid-20th century, a large portion of the globe was under communist regimes or threatened by them. And we also had before that the National Socialist Revolution. It was a radical revolution. They were eliminating the major source of evil that imprisoned the German people, the Jewish conspiracy, which also included Marxism for them. Millions of people died in that attempt. Now let me give you some historical generalizations from all of this, and then I won't get to as long. And I'm going over these so you see there's a larger historical context for the example in Islam. So very briefly, radical revolutions, as I've argued, originate in the idea of a divine or spiritual transformation of the human condition. Sources, the main line is Judeo-Christian in the West. The secondary line, as we'll see, is Islamic. The tertiary line is Taoist, with later admixtures of Buddhism and Zoroastrianism in China. The idea of revolution can be separated from the engendering sentiments and symbols and aspirations. So you could have a religious view here and a secular view here, but the sentiments are very similar. In the West, radical revolutions gained in size of operations over centuries, from the late Middle Ages until the 20th century. The later the radical revolutions tend to occur, the more violent and total they seem to be. This is just following the logic of revolution. Radical revolutions embrace both what we call the right and the left, National Socialism, Marxism. The necessary conditions, I think this is something important that other speakers are going to address in more detail from their perspectives in social science. The necessary conditions of radical revolution in addition, of course, to the very sentiments and idea, is a complicated triad of bold leaders, willing followers, and favorable circumstances. The revolution can appeal to the marginalized and disgruntled in society, like in the Middle Ages, landless peasants, unemployed laborers, resentful lower middle class people. These people then might feel anything is better than the current system and be willing to believe they are victims of a conspiracy. The objective circumstances reinforce this toxic belief. Revolutions do occur in the face of manifest injustices and calamities, situations that would truly seem to be apocalyptic, disastrous wars, plagues, famines, unprecedented economic woes. In spite of the apparent necessity and inevitability of these revolutions, if you look at the historical unfolding, they're not inevitable. Perhaps fortunately, no radical revolution has succeeded according to its own terms. Not so far, but there's always the next time. So those are just some generalizations. Now let me turn to Islam. And I'm going to have to assume that there's some general knowledge here, I hope, by now, if you just read the newspapers. We don't have time to go into the details, but we have a huge, massive transformation of the political landscape in the 600s and 700s because of the expansion of Islam from the Arabian Peninsula, eventually around 700 to dominate much of Eurasia from Spain through what is now Pakistan. We have the creation, all simultaneously, of a world empire, a world civilization, and a world religion. Rather unique. And although these radical sentiments are there in this religion that bases itself to some extent as a successor and fulfillment of the Jewish Christian tradition, because by the 700s, the Islamic world is ruling an empire, there tends to be a conservatism that takes place. You have to make do with things and make compromises in order to rule. But there's a potential for radical revolution. This is exacerbated by huge splits within Islam. The major split is between the Sunni and the Shiites. And originally this was over the succession, the successors of Muhammad. The third great successor, Muhammad Ali, was murdered by his rivals, the Umayyads, who established the caliphate in Damascus. The son of Ali, Hussein, was later murdered also near Karbala in present-day Iraq, and the Shiites celebrate that feast of Ramadan. This led to this split. What is a legitimate authority in the Muslim world? And when I say Muslim world, I don't mean in their view just a religious kind of institution. It included religion, the economy, and the polity. It included all of human society. The caliphs in Damascus and then later in Baghdad, or those in the Shiite tradition, and the word means the followers, the party of Ali. The imams. And within the Shiite tradition, there was a huge split that took place. They all agreed that there were 6 imams. But the son of the 6th imam was declared illegitimate. His name was Ismail, and his followers proclaimed him as the true imam. Others proclaimed another son as the true imam. And they then numbered them through 12 and believed that that last 12th imam disappeared from the world someday to return again as the Mahdi. Now the term Mahdi is used both by Sunnis and Shiites to mean some great person that's going to come back and save the Muslim world. Throughout the next few centuries, the Seveners, as they were called, the followers of Ismail, were more radical. In the late 900s, a group of them established themselves in North Africa, went to Egypt, and built their capital city of Cairo. They believed they were descendants of the daughter of Muhammad, Fatima, and they were the Fatimid dynasty, proclaimed themselves as the true successors of Muhammad and the only legitimate political organization on earth, in contrast to the Caliphate at Baghdad. And by the late 1100s, they were perhaps even larger in size and power. But then they had a split within themselves. The oldest son of the reigning caliph, as they call him, in Cairo, did not succeed his father when his father died. There was a succession rivalry. He was Nizar, and the followers of Nizar proclaimed that he was the legitimate ruler, really the only legitimate ruler in the world. And whether he was alive with them or spiritually present, his followers established fortresses in present-day Syria, Iraq, and Iran. They declared themselves as the only legitimate political institutions in the world, and they had the duty to fight everyone else, particularly the representatives of the Caliph, who are now Turkish rulers who ruled on behalf of the Caliph of Baghdad throughout the Middle East. They also attacked European crusaders, and they had a particular way of killing their opponents by assassination. Now, they were given that word, it originally means hashish, but that term became associated with their activities. They are like the suicide bombers of today. And for one brief reign in the late 1100s, one of these leaders of the assassins proclaimed that the resurrection had occurred, that they no longer had to be good Muslims, because now they were beyond that. The final days, the apocalyptic time, was now present during his reign. Now that gives us an idea of things to come. Now, just a brief mention that the Twelvers, for the most part, were more passive until the 20th century, when Ayatollah Khomeini made a new interpretation of the Twelver Shiites, that they could pave the way for the coming of the hidden Imam, the 12th Imam, to come back on earth. And that is the origins of the Iranian Revolution, which in the beginning at least was a radical revolution, and we could debate about its status now. But, surprisingly, the more conservative Sunnis also had potential for a radical revolution. Let me just briefly mention Salafism. With the collapse of the Caliphate of Baghdad in the 1200s, and the Mongols virtually killed everyone in Baghdad and destroyed the Caliphate. This was a crisis. This was an apocalyptic situation. And we have the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah, who proclaimed that Islam needed to go back to the purity of the original days of the fathers and follow, in the most literal way, the patterns of life in the days of Muhammad and his immediate successors. Now at this time, these were his writings, and he attacked the religious establishment. In the 1700s, in Arabia, we have Wahhabism originate as a successor to these views, and this is at the time of the obvious weakening of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Turks proclaimed themselves the successor caliphate, but they were under siege, and they were called the sick old man of Europe. In the 19th century, their empire was being gobbled up by various European powers. And so in light of this apocalyptic type situation, you have Wahhabism taking place and associating itself later with the Saudi dynasty, the Saudi clan in Arabia. These ideas became very prominent in the Indian subcontinent by Muslims from mainly present-day Pakistan who visited Mecca and brought these ideas back. They brought them back to exactly the same places today where we find the Taliban and other radical groups present in that area. Now, a brief word on Sayyid Qutb in his book Milestones. He too was in this tradition, but it took a more radical viewpoint. Not a violent one, though. Remember the logic of revolution. in his book Milestones, and he visited the United States of all places, and was totally shocked by the corruption in the United States, particularly when he went to Colorado of all places and saw people square dancing. He believed that you had to take the most literal interpretation of the Sharia law in Islam, and that most of world society was in a state of total ignorance of the right way to live. Jahili society, he called it. This was also present in the so-called Muslim world, where Muslims really didn't adhere to the true practices. You had the obligation to defeat the political and legal proponents of this ignorance, but he didn't say by violence, but you had to defeat them. And then you had to allow these ignorant people to freely convert to Islam, he said. And how you're going to do all of this, he didn't outline. He was advocating mainly education. But it wasn't long after that others, reading his book, took the next logical step and advocated violence against the Egyptian regime of Anwar Sadat, and eventually someone assassinated him. This leads to Al-Qaeda. And we know what happened at 9/11. Now, Al-Qaeda believed that they could pave the way for the coming of the caliphate in these last days. They didn't believe that they were themselves going to organize the caliphate, but they could pave the way. The final step in this logic of revolution took place with ISIS. Now, that's a term in the West, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or the Obama administration like to call it ISIL, substituting for Syria, the Levant. But their idea is that's the caliphate. That is the caliphate. That is the only legitimate political institution on earth. And I've outlined here some of the history. Perhaps I don't need to go to the details how the organization started as an affiliate of Al-Qaeda and virtually disappeared in the surge by the Americans in, I believe, 2008. But with the withdrawal of American forces and the civil war in Syria, what had been this Al-Qaeda affiliate then declared its independence of Al-Qaeda, particularly over this group in Syria, the Al-Nusra Front, which is still prominent there today. And in June 29, 2014, al-Baghdadi declared himself the caliph and that the caliphate had been restored. They believe it. Now, we don't know how many of the followers believe it entirely. There's all sorts of nuances that we'd have to go through to analyze the situation, but there's no question so far the leaders believe that this is the caliphate. They have apocalyptic ideas. They mention apocalyptic literature that's been prominent in Islam. The name of their major website reflects the title of a city on the border of Turkey and Syria that's supposed to be the site of an apocalyptic battle with evil. So they believe they are fighting on behalf of Allah to destroy all the evil institutions in the world, destroy the source of evil in the world, to resurrect true human society following the practices set down by the Prophet. So, they're not just terrorists. We can't say they have a complete regime. They kind of have an incipient regime. They have territory in Syria and Iraq, and we know now they, of course, have lost Mosul. They've lost other areas in the so-called Sunni Triangle. And I believe the Obama administration was planning to have the Kurds attack their capital in Syria, Raqqa. And then January 17th, we just found out in the paper yesterday, they decided to let the Trump administration decide on that. So they're losing territory, but they have other plans to spread their activities throughout the world. They have some still toeholds in Libya, Afghanistan. They made an arrangement with radicals in Nigeria, Boko Haram. So I would say this, that they're radical revolutionaries, at least the leaders firmly believe in what they're doing. And perhaps there's a time bomb here, if we're talking about security. There's no question in my mind, they're extremely adept at technology in the use of their website. They want weapons of mass destruction. They're seeking weapons of mass destruction. And if they get them, they can use them, and they probably will use them. I have no idea on the probability at this point of them getting them. But the longer they exist, the more the odds go up. And that is probably the greatest security threat for the world. I read you in the beginning a description of what happened in Cambodia. I can, of course, give you all details about the Third Reich and about the Stalinist Great Terror. These people are serious. So at least we have to know what we're dealing with. When we get down to followers who might come in and out and go to the website, they have all sorts of variables. But if we're talking about the core ideology, this is, unfortunately, an example of radical revolution. So I will leave it there as a kind of overview for your discussions in other areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. McPartland. That was there's a lot of information, very good information. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Wilfred Riley, who is professor or an assistant professor. Sorry, I was going to promote you 3 times, but that's how highly we think of him here. Of political science at Kentucky State University. And so, again, I will allow Dr. Riley to introduce himself more fully, and I'll set up your PowerPoint.
Sure, thank you. Hello?
Morning.
Good morning. I was actually just making sure you could hear me on the microphone. I think you could probably hear me without the microphone, actually. But this works at least as well. I'm going to read my intro from the official, I guess, biography for this event. Dr. Wilfred Riley is an assistant professor of political science at Kentucky State University. This is true. I'm a graduate of the University of Illinois College of Law and the Southern Illinois University PhD program in political science, with a focus in international relations. I saw ghost salukis in the back of the room. That sounds surprising, but all right. Move. I'm the author of the book, The $50 Million Question, an empirical examination of the relationship between privilege and pride, along with multiple refereed research articles, at least according to this. I'm a previous recipient of the Illinois DFI Fellowship and John Marshall, or CLEO, Legal Fellowship, and a current member of the Midwest Political Science Association and the American Bar Association. My professional interests include international relations, American racial and ethnic group relations, using actual empirical methods to test what I refer to here as sacred cow theories. Dr. Freeman, are you making some kind of signal? What would you like? What are you saying? Hold it like this?
Down a little bit.
It's loud. Yes. Well, yeah, that's why I said I can talk without it. All right. So this is better for the back table, or what? All right. Are you guys saying this is too loud? Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, what about this? This pitch better? I'm still not quite sure what's going on back there.
Pull it down a little.
Hold it away, or down.
There.
Yeah, it's not, this is just me talking, which is something I usually do when I speak in rooms this size.
Okay, I'm going to take over here.
All right.
Dr. Riley with the microphone. Dr. Riley without the microphone.
All right. Fair enough. I'm probably going to hold some kind of prop in my hand today, so I'm going to go get a piece of paper. And then we're going to get started here. Thanks, Queen. All right, fair enough. So my presentation is called Why We Fight, Testing the Predictors of Insurgency. I also didn't read the last so I will. When not working, Dr. Riley also enjoys archery, basketball, social media, and dogs. Riley has been called one of the great intellects of our time by himself, which is something I said as the final line of my bio on the book I wrote, making fun of sort of the extremely pompous author biographies you get in this field. It's true, I do have a high opinion of myself. That's not really here nor there. Let me see if the PowerPoint is set up here. So this is slideshow. Do I just click? Okay. Fair enough. So my presentation is a little different. The last one, obviously, an excellent synopsis of the history of revolution, really throughout history, at least written history. And I found one point there fascinating. The core of radical revolution is the idea of real substantive change in human nature. And I think when you said radical revolutions have never worked, that is because, sir, in my opinion, that is impossible. But I would agree, that's the core element that communism, the sort of apocalyptic Islam of an ISIS or an ISIL, let's not forget in Christian history our own multiple apocalyptic religious revolutions, all of these have had in mind the changing of human nature. The elimination of the drive for money, the elimination of prey drive, the elimination of sexuality. I do not think that is ever going to happen, and that's something worth keeping in mind. So, interesting point, sir. Now, I'm doing something very different. I'm a quantitative guy, and I'm taking an empirical look at what the primary predictors are just in the world as we see it now, among nation states over the past 40 years, of 3 different types of violence. So my violences, to use some social science speak, are internal homicide, and I made sure to get data for that includes mass shootings. Armed insurgency, which these days mostly means non-traditional war. We're talking about a lot of terrorist insurgencies, essentially. Shining Path, I do look at ISIL, so on down the line. And finally, just because I had the data there, I decided to look at what we think of as war, which is now a fairly small percentage of military violence, but by that I mean international land war, multi-states fighting. So I've got a bunch of variables in these statistical models. I'll see if I can remember these off the top of the head so I'm not facing backward to you the entire speech. But we've got democracy, we've got the Gini coefficient, income inequality within states. We've got the level of corruption. I was able to get new figures from the corruption index. Population density. Since this is a historically black college and I'm myself an ethnic guy, I was interested in racial and ethnic composition here. So I looked at essentially black majority states. That's one of the variables inserted in the model, which is a proxy for Africa. We often hear that Africa is violent. Is this true once you adjust for income, things like that? Islamic religion is a variable that I insert in the models for the same reason. And I'm particularly interested in 2 measures of diversity, which will come up on the next slide. I was able to get data mostly from the CIA World Fact Book. If nothing else, our spies know a lot about the people we share the world with, on 171 nation states. I believe there are currently 182 nations, but this is a pretty good sample size. So, moving forward. Oh, I forgot, I included this. Part of the inspiration for this, this presentation, I don't know if you can see the full image here. This is a man called Jared Taylor, who's the ideological founder of the alt-right. This is the profile picture on his website, which is him leaning sort of sensually against a wall of roses and hydrangeas. To each their own. But Jared Taylor and his movement have some particular opinions about diversity and how diversity influences nation states. So I look at this, I test this along with my other thesis questions during this presentation. So, the alt-right to some extent matters. This is quite literally a trending topic today. The rise of the alternative right. And what I think distinguishes the alternative right from the traditional conservative right is that in a sense you could say it is radically revolutionary as read the traditional ideas of modern Western democracy. So the racialist movement pretty open, and I'll use that term to include movements of this sort in Europe, so on down the line. The racialist movement pretty openly argues that different racial groups, and perhaps even different ethnic groups, have dramatically different levels of genetic potential. With, for example, East
Asians perhaps being more intelligent than black West Africans or Westerners. I will note, perhaps unsurprisingly, I don't agree with this. But because of this, the alternative right views diversity as a negative. They view primarily racial diversity and secondarily ethnic diversity as one of the major causes of violences within and between states. And there are a lot of very published books making this argument. Taylor himself, my debating opponent last spring, which is why this came up. But Taylor himself wrote a bestseller in 2011. Vox Day, which I suspect is a pseudonym, wrote one in 2015, arguing for the total end of immigration that would be legal or illegal into the West from the non-Western world. Ann Coulter has re-entered the scene. In 2016, she wrote Adios America, which unbelievably for a political book sold 4 million copies. And it made essentially this same argument, that Hispanic populations have lower IQs than Caucasians, or for that matter, American African Americans. This is genetic, which I think is the key barrier there. And all Hispanic immigration should be ended, or it is, I suppose, adios America. So obviously, there are examples of wars and conflicts caused by ethnic or racial diversity. The recent Rwandan and Bosnian genocides were purely ethno-religious wars. The Tamil and Sinhalese fighting in Sri Lanka strikes me as an extremely interesting example, because in this case, and I don't mean to make this as a joke, but you're seeing Buddhists commit religious and ethno-racial atrocities, which is quite rare. Buddhist holy war is a term you rarely get to use in my field. Zimbabwe, South Africa, SA, all of that is essentially racial. The white settlers, you hear the phrase one settler, one bullet. The whites are being dispossessed by the previously indigenous black population. There's a lot of fighting. And close to home, of course, we can't pretend, as we often do, that we Americans are unique, we're different from the tides of the world. I mean, we see Dylan Roof shot 9 people, including a congressperson in a packed church. Black Lives Matter. I mean, they're literally, whites, I suppose, are responding. They're literally race riots in some of our cities again. You see the rise of the white nationalist movement, the neo-Nazi movement. So obviously there are disputes that are caused by race and ethnicity. These are different terms, by the way. I'm using race in the classical biogenetic sense. I can discuss during the panel discussion whether that even exists. Ethnicity in the sense of linguistic or religious diversity. Obviously, and this is only the diversity variable that I'm discussing right now. I'll discuss the others on my next slide. But there also are arguments that diversity is a positive thing. And this isn't the focus. I will note very briefly some that I've made in the past. Diversity increases overall the quality of life. We find that patent rate, the quality of food, the quality of athletics, the rate of participation in business, even things as banal as Olympic gold medals, all of this tends to be enhanced by a greater diversity of races and ethnicities. The more flavors you add, the better the stew you get, is a famous old line from Studs Terkel. I added this, I think this is true, but this has nothing to do with today's presentation. Some argue that diversity maximizes human potential. A study called the Edinburgh Omnibus Study recently found that the biggest predictor of having tall, smart children was genetic diversity. And they reached some odd conclusions in that study. They say at one point that Puerto Ricans should logically be the perfect people. And they discuss why for a page. I have no comment on whether or not this is true. But this is a point that's often made in support of diversity, the maximization of human potential. Someday we will all be one people. We may perhaps speak 1 or 2 languages, and this obviously would improve the quality of life in the sense of eliminating many of the tensions that currently exist. And finally, I think the aspect of the diversity or the pro-diversity argument that really matters today is that many political scientists have argued that in fact it is the least diverse states in terms of actual racial diversity, actual socioeconomic diversity, even actual ethnic diversity in the sense of populations with different core languages. It is the least diverse nations in the modern cosmopolitan sense, nations such as Somalia or Kosovo, that tend to experience the most extreme, egregious violence. I will note, for example, ISIS or ISIL is operating entirely in Middle Eastern states that are in most cases 92 to 99% what we would describe as Arabic by racial or ethnic background. The large majority of people, in many cases almost all of the people there, are Muslim. So this is a counterpoint point to the argument that racial or ethnic diversity causes violence, right? The most violent states, Iraq, Syria, you can go on with this. Uganda, Congo, Bosnia, Moldova, Croatia. These tend to be uniracial, in many cases unireligious. But at any rate, this is just what I think. I now tested it. And I don't just talk about diversity, I look at a range of different variables here. So, some of the variables in my model, my dependent variables, one of my dependent variables is the homicide rate in a country, including mass shootings over the past 3 years. So how many citizens there, individually or in large groups, are murdered by their fellow citizens? A second dependent variable is the number of, since 1945, wars or major terrorist insurgencies in each individual nation. I will note that I don't do what I did for homicide, what is originally what I thought I was going to do, and Dr. Merlino mentioned this, for terrorism, i.e. look at average rate of individual terror attacks in each nation by year. And the reason for that is that international terrorism is actually fairly rare until it becomes armed insurgency in a nation. So I think that this is something to consider. As we discussed, for example, Mr. Trump's ban on refugees from 7 Muslim states, his argument is, well, this is preventing terror. This is preventing acts of domestic terror by foreign travelers. The average number of people killed by foreigners committing acts of terrorism on our own soil over the past 10 years has been around 17. So you're much more likely to be killed by a bee or by a lightning strike than in most cases by some exotic form of violence. So at any rate, this is dependent variable number 2 is the number of actual insurgencies, traditional armed insurgencies, terror insurgencies, so on, in a state since 1945. And my dependent variable, the third international war, is the number of international armed conflicts each state has been involved in since the same year, 1945. And there are full records of this kept online. You can find a bad version on Wikipedia. It's very easy to go into my own discipline of political science and look up lists of land wars. So all this data is pretty widely available. And against those 3 dependent variables, I'm looking at racial diversity, which is the number of genetic racial populations making up more than 1% of the national population. That's taken from the CIA World Fact Book. Again, that's available on Wikipedia, Britannica, a number of sources. I'm looking at ethnic diversity, which is the number of distinct, generally same race. So, for example, Irishmen and Italians in the United States have traditionally been considered ethnically diverse. So the number of distinct, generally same race, ethno-linguistic populations within a national population. So in the United States, we have most of the major races. You might define this as 4 or 5 or 6, if you believe race exists at all, another ongoing debate. And we have dozens, if not hundreds, of individual ethnicities. Many other states define ethnicities as tribes. So Democratic Republic of the Congo has 16 recognized tribes, for example. That would create my ethnicity variable. That's different from my race variable. And this is an important distinction. The DRC is about 99% black, if we want to recognize genetic racial categories, but it has 16 ethno-linguistic tribes within it. And as previously noted, I add 9 other variables. So democracy, a large population, increasing GDP, human development, and obviously I'm speculating that things like human development are going to have a negative effect on violence. You'll have less homicide, you'll have less war in more civilized developed countries. That will be a good thing. This is my argument. I'm arguing that corruption, I don't really have a strong feeling about these 2, but I hypothesize that Islam or majority black status, just to test the common thesis, population density, ethnic diversity, Gini, income inequality, I hypothesize that these things will have a positive effect on violence, which is bad. So I've got a bunch of different variables in play. I think obviously that some of them will reduce the level of violence in a nation taken on average among my group of nation states, and I think that others will increase it. And I guess to repeat that, I hypothesize democracy, racial diversity, large population, GDP, and human development are going to reduce violence, and the other things are going to increase it. And I test all of this in a linear multivariate regression run in the program Stata 13.0 with all of these independent variables in each case against each one of my dependent variables. So rate of terrorist and other insurgencies, and rate of international war, what we tend to think of just as war. So this is the data. Can any of you guys see that? All right. Well, I can move to discussing it. This is just a regression model that I cut and pasted. So any of the mathematicians, social scientists, I mean, feel free to come up to me after the presentation or during the panel and have a chat about this. But moving on into the results. So quite seriously now, there are a couple of very interesting things. Starting with homicide, we find, I think conclusion one, I don't know if you can read this, but it says inequality kills. So this is the most important thing probably I find across all three models. The single biggest predictor of increasing homicide rate, and there's a fantastic range here. Nations varied between 0.04 homicides per 100,000, that was Singapore, up to 91 homicides per 100,000 people, that was Honduras. But the single biggest predictor of increasing homicide was increasing income inequality, measured by the Gini coefficient that the UN and other NGOs use. So this is a multi-unit variable that goes up between 0.01 and 100, so there are 100 units. And each, in unstandardized terms, if you're interested in mathematics, each increase in the Gini coefficient by 1 point marked a half of 1 point increase in homicide. So simply increasing income inequality from 0 to 100 would mean 50 additional deaths per 100,000 people. Inequality killed. This is one of the most striking findings that came out of this project. Each shift of unequal wealth distribution upward by 1 point correlated with half of the human life. Striking. It's worth noting how we in the United States fall on the Gini scale, by the way. It's not very good. We're about halfway up it. So in terms of stopping violence on our streets, so on down the line, we don't necessarily need an increase in average income as much as we need a distribution of wealth that is more equitable. At least if stopping violence is a goal. I say for the math geeks, this relationship is extremely statistically significant. The p-value is 0.0000, which is hard to get in the STATA program. This is a real thing. I also find, I say don't stereotype here. I think this is interesting. I threw in Islamic and Black African countries into this model because I wanted to see if we frequently talk about these as violent regions of the world. And I wanted to see if they were with other variables adjusted for them. And everyone's a cynic. I suspected they would be, frankly. And I hypothesized that openly before I really got going with the project. But they're not. If you adjust for income, which is not always done, Islamic and Black nations had lower than average homicide rates. The beta for the Islamic variable was negative 0.336, meaning that on average Muslim countries have 3 fewer murders per 100,000 people than non-Muslim countries. That's not a massive difference, but it is pretty significant. We definitely can't view these as these sort of savage lands. I mean, for every given, there's the United Arab Emirates. Their average beat the Western average. Black African states did average significantly more homicides than Western states. So up front, both societies have things to work on. But when you adjust for income, the beta for the Black nations variable was 0.5 or 5.34. That means on average, Black countries average 5 murders less than do equivalently funded, incomed Western countries. So you can't compare Ghana to Britain, but you can compare Ghana to Moldova, and Ghana wins that exchange. Clashes can occur. Racial diversity did have a slight positive increase on homicide rate. I think this is across nations. I think even in the United States, you'll notice that at the sort of gang level, a group of young men, blacks, whites, Hispanics, can sometimes fight. This didn't reach statistical significance. I felt ethically I should report it, but this is increase was 4. So on average, very diverse nations average 4 more murders than non-diverse nations. But the standard error for that was about 3. And that didn't quite reach statistical significance. So we could probably say there's a little more fighting at the level of individual gun or fist fighting in diverse nations. As we'll see later, there's not much evidence that racial diversity has much impact on war fighting. Finally, I thought this was interesting. Corruption decreased the homicide rate. So the more corrupt a nation was, on I believe a 5-point scale, each increase of 1/5 of a point in corruption dropped murders by 0.12, which is a 1/12 of a murder. So there may be some very slight effect of bribery on violence between, say, citizens and the police, or between violence among groups of narco-traffickers or something like that. But corruption overall had a negative, which means good, effect on the homicide rate. In Latin America, the more corrupt countries in general have less murders than the less corrupt countries. Many of the less corrupt countries are nearly at war with drug trafficking syndicates. But I don't know what to say about that. These last two findings, again, statistically are not especially significant. The notable things were inequality and the high performance of the Islamic and African nations. All right, here's some more raw data. Armed insurgency and terrorist insurgency. Let you guys admire that for a second. All right. Anyway, now, this is interesting, again, because what I find here, now I think racial diversity is good. Assimilated, and using that in the positive sense of that term, diversity of people from different populations, different cuisines, different histories of invention to draw from for the patent pool, that's good. But ethnic diversity turns out not to always be positive. So only one variable was significant as a predictor of civil war, which I call intranational armed insurgency. Now, an insurgency was defined as any conflict significant enough to make, and I can give you the citation if you want, but the list of land wars in my discipline. So, for example, there's several of these: land wars 1945 to 89, wars 2001 to 2010, so on down the line. So this generally requires more than 1,000 deaths, and I defined an intranational or a civil war, obviously, as involving only internal belligerents. So an example of this would be the quote-unquote Shining Path conflict in Peru in the 80s and 90s. So what I'm looking at here, this second variable, is armed insurgencies, terrorists or civil militias, people fighting a civil war. The one variable that was statistically significant at predicting insurgency was ethnic or tribal diversity. And again, this is the presence within a state not just of different races, not just of people with different ethnic heritage, but of multiple non-assimilated linguistic population groups. There's a definition of this given in Horowitz 2000, Ethnic Groups in Conflict. Obviously, universally well-known resource in political science. But this, again, you can find this in the CIA World Factbook. It's very easily available online, Wikipedia, Britannica. But the more non-assimilated linguistic population groups you have in a country, i.e. independent, self-identifying, proto-national populations, the more likely civil war is. This variable is significant at the 0.002 level. T-value is 3.21. And by itself, ethnic diversity, non-assimilated linguistic populations in a nation, explained about 40% of all of the revolutions and terror campaigns that I examined. This would seem to sum up, for example, vast violence in Spain. To some extent, if you look at the Gaelic training materials and so on, the antics of the Irish Republican Army, a lot of the Indio violence against what are perceived as blanco, corrupt white governments in Latin America. This is ethnic rather than racial diversity, and specifically it's non-assimilated ethnic diversity. So that's interesting. And again, I want to emphasize this doesn't have anything to do with race, because the key variable that gets these groups included on this list of linguistically identified population is still being an insular group with a self-identified preferred language. So the racial diversity variable, when I look at intranational armed conflict, was totally non-significant. Again, for those of you that are the mathematicians, the p-value for that was 0.946. So racial diversity has no impact whatsoever, I think we can fairly say, or at least I can say from my data. Nothing is absolutely known in science which distinguishes it from religion, but at least I can say we didn't find any harm for racial population diversity. In fact, it was a positive at the level of civil war, but ethnicity was not, and that's interesting to me. Now, I think by this point I convinced even myself to stop putting in the data slides. So we're just moving on to international law here. But this was an interesting one. And again, all societies have advantages, disadvantages. So actually I'll just start from the top. So first of all, the most significant predictor of international war, even though I didn't test for this is an independent means test, was being the United States. That's not a joke. The United States has fought 21 wars from 1945 to present, although we've managed not to declare most of them. So along with our close allies, such as Britain, if you take either the United States itself independently in the little means test, or you take the pool of Western NATO nations, you're going to find about 9 times the rate of war fighting that you do for nations overall. So being us was the single biggest predictor of war. Now, among all countries, this is partly explained by this. Population, i.e. 0.001, was a 0.001 level of significance, I can clarify that. Population was an extremely significant predictor of international warfighting. And this again is interesting, and this mirrors what I think I found with the black African states and with the Muslim states, which is we tend to stereotype. We talk about small mad dogs, we talk about the axis of evil. In fact, if you adjust for income, Islamic states and African states were less likely to fight wars. No, they had a lower homicide rate. They weren't less likely to fight wars. Turns out they're also less likely to fight wars. Sorry, a bit of mental confusion there. But population was the most significant predictor of international warfighting. So we speak of small nations, North Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, as being the most likely belligerents in the world. Again, as this indicates, that's not really true. The nations that fought the most wars were Russia, ourselves, of course, right up in the top couple, Britain, Germany, China, Iran, which is, of course, that great ancient Persian Empire, even Canada, which was a World War II participant and fought often since. All of these nations fight in far more declared wars than smaller, more primitive nations. And in fact, this is something that's been discussed, I'd say in sociology more than in political science, that I've heard referred to as bully syndrome. There's a tendency to see those on the outside. The kid in a black trench coat in a high school hallway. The other man, to quote Foucault. There's a tendency to see those on the outside as dangerous. In fact, the leaders of the inside, in many paradigms, tend to be responsible for, by far, most of the violence. And we do find that here. Large nations are much more likely to fight than small nations. They're quite likely to fight each other. The USA obviously fought primarily Germany and Japan, with a secondary player being Italy during World War II. You rarely see Tanzania engage in the same kind of behavior. So at any rate, there was a slight positive effect of Islam on war. So Islamic states were more peaceful at home, but more likely to fight to seek conquests abroad. Although Islam did not have the same effect on war fighting as population did. So, got through that pretty quickly. This was something left over from one of my old lessons, and after serious talk, a koala bear. I do ask if there are any questions, but in fact, as I understand, we're going to be having a panel discussion with all of the speakers later. So I think I'm going to take my seat. Hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Riley. That was very interesting and entertaining, I think. We are now going to break for lunch and do our poster presentations. And as we begin that, I would like the poster presenters to please stand so that I can acknowledge you all. Up, children. Okay. Over here we have Kelvin Brooks, Emily Burgraff, or Amanda, Talib Aldemar, Chandler Aldemar, Eddie Wright, Mia Turner, I knew that. And back on the camera, Ivan Duvall and Robbie Olson will be presenting our posters, and also Professor Laquita Smith and Professor Marlene Browning, who have recently graduated from our master's program in interdisciplinary behavioral science. The posters are along the back of the wall, so I'd like to propose that if our presenters will take their places, the handouts are back there in the box on the table, ladies and gentlemen. We will break for lunch. Now, lunch is downstairs 2 floors in the caf, so those of you who are from Kentucky State University, if you'll be ambassadors for us and help folks find the cafeteria as they go down. But take some time, we'll reconvene at 12:30, but take some time to look at the posters, talk to our presenters, go down, grab some lunch in the caf, come back up, enjoy your refreshments that are up here, and take an opportunity to visit with our poster presenters as you break for lunch. Any questions? Yes? Yes. So go ahead, you may leave your laptops and all your stuff in here. There will be people in here all along. So we'll see you back here at 12:30.
So, my name is Dr. Sharp. I guess a little bit of information about myself. I previously worked in law enforcement for roughly a decade. I worked in both juvenile corrections, and I was also a sheriff's deputy in Ohio for roughly 8.5 years. After I left law enforcement, I went into teaching. I've been teaching since 2010. For 2 years, I actually worked in both fields. I left law enforcement full-time in 2012. All my undergraduate work is in criminal justice. My master's degree is also in criminal justice, but it has a specialization in forensic psychology, and my PhD is in psychology, and again, I have a specialization in forensic psychology. So, today I'm going to talk about profiling radicals and profiling terrorists. First, I'm going to cover some of the points to do with the known fields of profiling and what we do in those fields, and then transition into now how we're using those practices to now profile terrorists and how there's differences in these approaches, and also talk about what we do know and what we don't know, because when we do transition into profiling terrorists, there's a lot we don't know, and there's an extremely small amount of empirical research that has been done on creating profiles of terrorists. So, I know the previous presenters talked about taking questions at the panel, so I'll still stick to that, but I like to interact with my audience, so feel free to, when I ask you a question, to not answer it, and that way we can have awkward silence. So, but if you would, feel free to be involved. Feel free to shout out. Hopefully not any obscenities. So, I'd first like to start off with this one example. It's not the very first time profiling was ever used, or the first time it was used in the 20th century, but it's a seminal case, and most people, if you know about profiling, might be knowledgeable on it, and it's about the Mad Bomber of New York, and this occurred between 1940 and 1956. And they had all these bombings around the city, and basically they had no suspects. They didn't know what to do. They never put two and two together. And then finally, they approached this psychiatrist, Dr. James Russell, and they asked him if he could get involved in possibly developing a profile of who they should be looking for, because up to this point they were really, swing and miss. So he got involved, and kind of, if you've ever seen the newer Sherlock Holmes, when he thinks everything over in his mind, and then he doesn't. And this is kind of what Dr. Russell did, and he gave a very, very, very specific profile. If you look at some of the points that he talked about, he said, when you do find this suspect, he's probably going to be a heavy middle-aged man. He's also going to be unmarried. He might be living with a sibling. He would be a skilled mechanic from Connecticut, extremely specific there. Roman Catholic. Also had obsessional love for his mother, and also harbor a hatred towards his father. Very Freudian in that aspect. He noted that the offender would have a personal vendetta against Consolidated Edison because the very first bombing that occurred was at their headquarters. And he also mentioned when the police found him, he would be wearing a double-breasted suit, and it would be buttoned. So that's extremely specific. So finally, they looked around, started doing some police work. I guess long story short, came to a suspect, interviewed him, figured out, hey, this is the guy we want. But he asked if he could change before they took him downtown. So went into his bedroom, came out, and guess what? He was wearing a double-breasted suit, buttoned. So if I was Dr. Russell at that point, mic drop, walk away, never do anything again. He was right on almost all of these points. So this was kind of the start of when basically profiling got big, became more mainstream, and we thought we could actually utilize it within the field. So where do we start? We have a couple different types of profiling that we do. We do criminal profiling, psychological profiling, and then also victimology. Because I only have 30 minutes, You get the real brief elevator ride overview of all of these. So criminal profiling, what do you think we're doing there? Thank you for the awkward silence. Go ahead.
I had a question. My question was, what is profiling?
Profiling is when we want to come up with an idea of, depending on which one we're using, if we're talking about criminal profiling, we want to come up with a profile of possible suspects or a singular suspect of a type of crime. So say you go to a crime scene and it was a bank robbery and we have no suspects. So what do we do from there? Well, we start to create a profile of possible suspects that we should start to look into. So say there's no physical evidence at the scene, so we don't have a whole lot to go on. Well, now we're going to have to start to look at who's previously committed these types of crimes, what are their characteristics, what are different factors that we can go off of, and kind of go from there. So hopefully that answers. So criminal profiling, this can be done both before and we can do some work with this afterward, even after people are caught, to help build different types of typologies, and I'll talk more about those here in a second. Psychological profiling, if criminal profiling is the who, psychological profiling would basically be the why and the how. Because we want to know the mind processes of criminals, when they commit their crimes, why they committed their crimes, understand what their beliefs were, and basically get a better understanding of how their mind worked, so we could possibly use that to benefit the field later on. And then lastly, victimology. You might be questioning, well, if we're trying to solve crimes and arrest criminals, well, why would we look at the victims? Does anybody know why we would look at the victims? Go ahead.
Because looking at the victims can sometimes give a pattern that gives you more insight into the mindset or what the goal is of the criminal.
Yeah, the victims give us more information about the offenders. There's a thing called the victim-offender overlap, to where we know an overwhelming majority of crimes, both the victim and the offender share a lot of similarities and a lot of characteristics, such as gender, such as socioeconomic status, race or ethnicity, geographical area. So it's very, very rare that we have an offender and a victim who do not share a majority of their characteristics. So if we had a victim who was Caucasian, who was in their mid-20s, who was middle class, and lived in New York, it would be extremely rare to have an offender who was, say, African American, lived in Ohio, and was of low socioeconomic status. Those are kind of the outliers. So more oftentimes than not, they do share those commonalities, and there's also, they usually also share some type of knowledge of each other. And this is not to say that they're friends or they're acquaintances, but possibly they worked at the same place. So maybe they knew of each other, but they didn't know each other, if that makes sense. So when we put together these profiles, some of the things that it can include are psychological variables, such as personality traits, psychopathology, so if they suffer from any type of mental disease or mental defects, behavioral patterns, demographic variables, age, race, geographical location. We can also use these to narrow down if we have several suspects. We can narrow down the field, or we can use previous profiles to know how to approach and interrogate a suspect that we already have. Because we'll use previous occurrences and previous profiles to try to understand why these different criminals committed their crimes and how to approach them, what was their thought processes, and come to a better understanding. So what are we looking for? With any type of those profiles, we're looking for patterns. So we're looking if, say, we've had a rash of bank robberies, and these all happen on Tuesdays around noon. So is there a pattern there, or is it just coincidental? You know, which leads to the next part, are they related? And if they are, that helps us to probably come to the conclusion that more than likely they might have been committed by the same person or the same group of people. Characteristics. what are some characteristics of previous people who've committed these crimes, and that helps us to build a profile. Again, if we have no known offender, or no known suspect, and are there similarities between the two? Because if we think of crimes like murder, not every murder is the same. Not every murder has the same motives. Not every murder has the same end goal or end means. So we want to further our understanding of why people commit these crimes, why they started off with in the first place, going in, like made the final decision, yes, I'm going to follow through and commit this, and then hopefully use that to deter other people. And then these different clues help us to paint the picture more clearly. So who does this? Who uses profiling? The FBI, local law enforcement, NASIC, that's the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, that's in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton. TSA, I'm sure a majority of us have gone through the airport. When they go through and they have the random searches, those aren't so random. They've created profiles of people who, depending on the crimes, and then they use those profiles to, not so randomly, pick people who also are similar to those characteristics. The court system at times uses this, especially if we have attorneys who want to use profiling to argue their case. Usually the prosecution does this. Psychologists, and then lastly researchers and scholars. So if we're looking at specifics of crimes, and if you're wondering when the terrorism and the radicalization comes in, I'm trying to give an overview, and then I'll come back around to that aspect of it. So we want to know the MO of the offender, and we also want to know if they do have a signature, and if they do, what is it? So if we're looking at MO, this is how the criminal goes about their crime. It's their procedure. And this is fluid in nature, because you can plan, and you can be the best planner in the world, but that doesn't mean everything's going to happen as you anticipate. So MO is just how they carry it out, whereas the signature makes it specific to the offender. Like say, real basic example, they leave a playing card with all their crimes. That's their signature. That's what they're known for. So there's difference in that, whereas MO can change, signature will stay the same and stay unique to the offender. Now when I talk about radicals and terrorists, their signature, what we would use, depends on the type of terrorism that they're carrying out. So if we're looking at bomb makers, we would look at, or suicide bombers, we would look at how they built their products, where they got their products from, what they used, the types of materials, and then lastly, their targets would be something else that we look at. Do they specifically target, say, schools or churches or places where there would be lots of immigrants? So when we generate a profile, here's some of the things that we put into it and some of the things that we use. First of all, a comprehensive study of the nature of the criminal act and then the types of persons who have committed similar acts in the past. The old saying, if you don't learn from the past, you're doomed to repeat it. So we look at everything that's happened before, and then again, we try to create a profile to prevent things in the future. A detailed analysis of the crime scene, in-depth examination of the background of the activities of the victim, a formulation of possible motivating factors for all parties involved. An example we can give that just happened the other day, if you're not familiar with the prison riot that just happened, and you had the correctional officer who was killed, and the state police said that there was 126 inmates in that cell block, and they said at this point in time, all 126 are suspects. So we use basically a funnel analogy. We'll start off with anything and everything, all of the information, then slowly but surely we'll narrow that down farther and farther and farther until we get to exactly what we need or what we want. The development of a description of the perpetrator based on overt characteristics from the crime scene and also past criminals' behavior. And then lastly, we want to distinguish on whether they were organized or disorganized. When we talk about there, as if they were organized, did they bring the tools they needed to complete the job with them? Were they prepared to do it? Or basically, did they ad-lib? If I came in to kill someone and I didn't have a weapon, but I found a pencil and I used that, or I found a spoon, more than likely that's disorganized in nature. So we use profiling quite a bit in law enforcement, but when we apply it to terrorism, the empirical research on this is almost next to nothing. And it's not so much that we don't have, or there isn't a profile for the typical atypical terrorist. It's just basically that we haven't found one yet. Just to give you a term of what we would start with when we're putting together this profile, well, what is a terrorist? What is terrorism? The Code of Federal Regulations defines it as the unlawful use of force or violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce the government, the civilian population, any segment thereof, in furtherance of political or social objectives. And another point, I wanted to bring up this quote at the bottom. It says that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. So when we put together these profiles, they can be viewed drastically differently depending on the population we're talking to. So if we went around and just had people shout out, well, what do you think is a typical profile of a terrorist? Some of the responses we would most likely get would be male, uneducated or undereducated, impoverished, and then between the ages of 18 and 23. But if we use these, we know that these are basically just stereotypes. So where do we go from there? How do we start creating these profiles? So if we look at other suggestions, we can say that if we look at personality characteristics, things like that they might be spoiled, disturbed, cold and calculating, perverse, excited by violence, psychotic, maniac, irrational, and fanatical. What about any of those? Are we still using stereotypes? Are we getting closer? If we take the terrorist activities that we have seen and the terrorists that we have seen up until this point, basically we're all over the board. We have some with low education levels, we have some with high education levels. We have some with families, we have some that are single. We have some who are men, we have some who are women. We have some foreigners, and we have others who are citizens. So basically, the three main points that we want to address to create a better profile that we can use, that we know is valid, and that we know is reliable, are we asking the right questions? If we're using the same processes we use to find criminals, are we going to have similar results if we apply that to terrorism and to terrorists? You say yes?
Yeah.
Anybody would like to disagree?
I disagree.
And why so?
Because if it's a terrorist, that means they're not from the same environment that we're living in. They're coming to destroy our environment. So they don't have the same patterns or same routine that they would as a criminal that you found in the community.
Possibly, yes. Is this too? Go ahead, Dr. Lee.
I was just going to say very quickly, I think that some of those characteristics, like male, definitely would survive as part of the terrorist profile. Some kind of fanatical belief, maybe. I think there are things that would be strongly associated with most sorts of crime, and certainly with terrorism.
Yeah, there's a general theory or thought out there that just like criminals, terrorists learn from previous terrorists. And the thinking is that eventually they will learn from the mistakes that other terrorists have made, and therefore they would become more successful in the attacks that they carry out. And that's kind of the scary thing. And one of the reasons why we put together these profiles to prevent that from happening. So the last point, asking who, this might be just as difficult as asking why. So not just finding out who does these type of activities, but also understanding why they do these type of activities. And I have a couple different examples that just show the wide variety and the fact that it makes it so hard to whereas if we look at specific crimes and create profiles from them, and we're generally pretty accurate in those, and we apply it to terrorism and radicalization, we're really throwing darts at a dartboard. If we look at the July 7th, 2005 attacks in London, the 4 attackers, 3 were second-generation British citizens with Pakistani parents, and one of those had parents who were Jamaican. So, kind of the topic of the day now, if we look at the president's new immigration ban, these were all second-generation citizens, so are we going to stop every immigrant from coming in just because there's a possibility? Does this help our profile? More than likely not. Kamal Borgas in the Racine plot. That was the bioterrorism plot in the subway system. He was Algerian asylum seeker. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. He had an English mother and Jamaican father. Omar Mateen, the Orlando nightclub shooter. He was American-born with Afghani parents. Ramzi Youssef, the 93 World Trade Center bombings. He was Pakistani by birth, and he came to the United States with fake immigration papers. So, at this point in time, you can't say, well, again, I'll compare it to President Trump's immigration ban. He has these 7 different countries. We can't say, well, all of the terrorists are coming from this area. Well, they're coming from everywhere. And then there's also the fact that I can talk about, some of them are American. Some of them come right from here. So, we'd have to put a red dot in our own country. But what we do know is some predisposing risk factors that we can use and that we have learned that are pretty beneficial. So if a person starts to check off a lot of these, this is a good indicator. First one is presence of some emotional vulnerability, and I put chum to the sharks. They can see this. If somebody's vulnerable, they know that's the person we should focus on. That's the person we can get to start to coerce them into believing in our ideals and get them to join our group. And then hopefully the end goal is to get them to commit or do something. Anger, alienation, or disenfranchisement. Dissatisfaction with current activities. And this is a big one right now. We have a lot of protests all around the country and all around the world. And basically, they come to the point where they say, these protests aren't doing anything. We're basically just yelling and screaming. Some people are throwing rocks through Starbucks. But they're saying, this has no effect. This isn't proving our point. This isn't furthering our goals. So we have to step it up from here. And like it says, it leads to the belief that terrorism is absolutely necessary. This is the only way we will be heard. This is the only way we will be understood. So this is the next step that we have to take. The next one would be identification with victims, both real and fictitious. If I go back to those examples, a lot of them talked about how they sided and how they had empathy towards, especially the ones who were Muslim. They talked about how they had empathy towards how Muslims were treated around the world, and that they were taking and carrying out these acts basically because of the way they were being treated. Belief that engaging in violence against the state or symbols is not inherently immoral. And it can be fine-tuned by religious leader or leaders, but basically, generally the person holds these before or at the time of their involvement in these terrorist groups. Also a sense of reward. My life, if I sacrifice it, there's nothing more I can gain or do in this world that would be as good or better as what I can earn in the afterlife. So this would be martyrdom, or the example that's given quite often, 70 virgins in the afterlife, and on and on. So basically, if I carry out this act, I'll be rewarded greatly, more so than anything I can earn here. And then I put the last one in red because this is probably the most important. It says kinship or social ties to those experiencing similar issues are already involved. It's kind of, if you know somebody in a group, it's that much easier for you to also get in that group. So if we go from groups, these terrorist groups, to individuals, and I have a couple different examples here. In June 2016, the Orlando nightclub attack. July 2016, the Dallas sniper attack. November 2016, the attack on Ohio State's campus. And then here just last month, the attack at Fort Lauderdale Airport. Now, 3 of these have a common similarity, and one does not. Does anybody know what that similarity between 3 of these individuals is? Or any guesses? What characteristic did they share? Go ahead.
I was gonna say one person versus like a group, like friends.
Yeah, all of these were carried out by individuals. Go ahead.
OSU attack was the only one that used a knife, the other used guns.
That would be a good thing because we would want to know a weapon, but that wasn't the similarity that I'm looking for. 3 of the 4 actually, at the time or before their attack, talked about their allegiance or their empathy to ISIS. And that would be the Orlando nightclub, the OSU attacker, and then the shooter at the Fort Lauderdale airport. The one at the Fort Lauderdale airport, actually, he is actually in custody, and he said, beforehand, he actually went to a local FBI office and said that ISIS was controlling his mind and forcing him to watch these ISIS videos online. So the Dallas sniper attack, that one was during a Black Lives Matter protest, and some of the information that they gathered afterwards was he carried out that attack due to, he wanted to further the ideals of the Black Lives Matter group, even though this was obviously without their permission or without their blessing. So a big question about these is we're starting to see a lot more of these, where just one single individual is carrying out these acts rather than a coordination or coordinated by a group. So even though they're carried out by individuals, should we consider these what is called like the lone wolf attacker? Should we consider them that? See some shaking heads, no in the back. Why not? Is there truly a lone wolf attacker? Go ahead.
Yes. If someone is not coordinating with anyone else and internally radicalizes and decides to act entirely on their own, doesn't tell anyone their intentions, doesn't give anyone else the target, and acts on their own, absolutely that's a lone wolf.
Perfect example of that would be the Unabomber. Acted on his own, carried out basically his own mission. But if we look at these ones specifically, and like I said, they had that similarity to where they all had some type of connection in some way, shape, or form to ISIS. So, because of that, are they still lone wolves? Or should we group them in with that group? Go ahead. Yeah.
Would the shooting in South Carolina be considered as a lone wolf attack?
Dylan Wolf, or his last name was Wolf. Root. I'm sorry. I would say no, because he had a lot of similarities in attributes related to white supremacy. So I would categorize him more within like someone carrying out an attack for a hate group or in the name of a hate group. And that's kind of what I'm questioning here. You have these 3 individuals who committed these different acts, but they have that ISIS tied to them. So are they individuals or are they a group? If we look around recent happenings all around the globe, we're having more and more of these individualized attacks. So we kind of have to question whether are these people acting on their own or just because, say, hey, they went online, they saw one video, and that was basically the straw that broke the camel's back that made them decide to carry out these acts. Are they still an individual, or do we bring them into that composite when we create our profile of, okay, these are people we should put together under ISIS.
I mean, even if they're doing this alone, and you may not want to group them with somebody, hasn't ISIS groomed them from a young age to head this direction psychologically anyway?
See, that's,
Still put them with a group.
yeah, that's another misconception that, they're kind of plucked out of these towns and neighborhoods at a very young age, and they're groomed to be terrorists for the rest of their lives. Another thing we need to understand is all of these terrorist organizations, it's just like any business. There's people who do different things. You have people who deal just with money. You have people who deal just with recruiting. You have people who, if they're successful, are a suicide bomber only one time. There's different things that they do. Not everybody, and then as Dr. Molina is going to talk about, you have some people who just deal with propaganda. So just like a regular business, they all have different functions, and that's one of the things that is detrimental to creating these profiles because they do different things. So we can't just say, all right, we have this profile, and these are the people we need to look out for who might possibly be suicide bombers. Because to this point in time, there's been so much difference, we've not been able to do that.
Any questions?
That was kind of quick. Go ahead.
So can you profile somebody by the way they look?
I guess I would need like a rephrase. What's the end mean in that?
Can you profile somebody by the way they look?
So I'll kind of pose it this way. So use the example before, we have a rash of bank robberies. We come up with a profile and say we're looking for, from previous bank robberies in this area, we know that it's probably somebody young, probably somebody who's Caucasian, this, that, and the other thing, and we're driving around, or law enforcement's driving around, and they see somebody fitting, the typical fitting, you fit the description, that's why we stopped you. And the answer is yes, they do that.
Okay, now, I think he was hitting more along the lines of, let's say a different war, like war on drugs, and profiling and stopping Fritz. Boom, he looks like the usual suspect.
Yes.
Bam.
Yeah.
And
We're bordering on, we're going past criminal and psychological profiling there to racially profiling people. And the matter of fact is, yes, we do this. I was at another conference and I was sitting next to an individual. He was a Chicago police officer and brought up a similar question. And there was a lot of debate on using that. And he goes, well, if I'm in a predominantly African-American neighborhood and I see a young Caucasian male driving around, in a nicer vehicle, to me that sticks out. He's not supposed to be there. We could argue that they're using that just based on the fact that he's white and he's there. Should that be the sole determining factor on us taking any action? So.
Yeah, I was just going to add to this gentleman's question, actually. I mean, when you said it's fairly difficult to profile, I think there's a tendency, I certainly noticed this in my classes, toward the PC here. But I noticed that of the, you listed a total of 10 people that were terror suspects or had been charged in connection with terrorist activities. And in terms of impossibility to profile, I couldn't help but notice that all of them were men. All of them were under 35, and 8 of them were Muslim, identified with Muslim terrorist groups. The other 2 were Christian racists, Dylan Roof and the police shooter. So couldn't you say something like young, religious, perhaps especially Muslims in this country, just religious, young, religious, male, that's who's going to be involved in most of these? That gets into a lot of legal issues, but empirically, would you say that's true?
It's because of the lack of empirical research that we can't say that. From what I've found, there's basically been 3 comprehensive studies, empirical studies, that are looking at profiling terrorists and people who join terrorist organizations. And they haven't been able to boil it down to that, even though these examples, we can start to pick out similarities with them. But it's kind of like, okay, I grabbed in a bag of marbles, and just by chance I pulled out 5 that were the same color. Does that mean that's always going to happen? No.
No, absolutely valid point. I obviously know this much better than I do. I do think if you look through most of the terror data, that young males affiliated with an extremist Muslim or Christian organization, I think that would be a very large disproportionate percentage of people.
Yeah, if we look at just criminals and we look at profiling used in that, we know that overwhelming majority of them are male, they're under the age of 30, they're lower socioeconomic status, lower education levels, and a majority of them are also belonging to some minority group. So, but when we look at this, we had a great history this morning, and if we go all the way, that far back and start including all of those people, that's going to make it even more convoluted, because then we're getting into these different nationalities. So, although it sounds pretty simple, it's really not. So, any other questions, comments? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Sharp. That was a really great presentation as well. So in terms of the presentations today, my own is the last on the agenda. Following this, we'll do a brief question and answer with the panelists while we distribute the workshop materials. And then we will go forward with the workshop activity. So let me just introduce myself to everyone very briefly. I'm Dr. Mira Merlino. I am the Associate Professor of Psychology and Sociology here at Kentucky State University, and I'm also the coordinator of our master's program in interdisciplinary behavioral science, whose work you have seen here today from Qui and Marlene Browning. So I come from the West, where things are a little bit different, and I come from the land, I like to tell people I come from the land of slot machines and legalized prostitution. So when I came to this part of the country, it was kind of a different part of the country for me, and I'm learning how to adapt to different cultures. So I began to notice some things culturally that were very different between the West and Kentucky. One of them being, of course, that I come from the land of slot machines and legalized prostitution. But today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how ideologies are created and formed, how they are different in different parts of the country, and I'm going to talk about some of the processes that are involved in this idea of getting people to join your particular cause. And so today we're going to talk about, from a social construction perspective, how to construct an enemy, how to create an enemy, and then how to entice people into your cause and to act against that enemy. Okay. So social cognition is how we tend to view others. So there are actors and observers, and social cognition often takes the perspective of the observer. So we, as it says here, it's a subfield of social psychology. We deal with person perception, attribution, how we explain causes and behaviors. We deal with attitudes, which is, we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth, and discursive psychology, which is a way, discursive psychology is the study of the language of power and of action. And so we're going to be taking these perspectives and combining them to look at this idea of the effectiveness of propaganda. Okay, so what is that exactly? Okay, defined as the spreading of ideas, information, or rumor for the purpose of helping or injuring an institution, a cause, or a person. And we just have been propagandized almost to death here in the last 6 months or so because of the election. But the thing to keep in mind is that propaganda is not necessarily true, and nor is it, in most instances, particularly flattering, as you can see the propaganda pictures down there on the bottom right. So, why does it work? How do we do propaganda campaigns, and what makes them ring true to people? So in order to talk about that, we're going to talk about the foundations of propaganda. And the foundations of that would be attitudes. Attitudes are hypothetical constructs. We can't see attitudes. We can't point at something and say that is an attitude. But we can look at the behaviors that are indicators of attitudes. So we're going to talk using the ABC model of attitude formation. Okay? So the components of that model are affect, or emotion, okay? You have a feeling about something. Behavior is the action that you do in response to the following. You have a thought or a cognition, you have a feeling about that cognition, and then the cognition and the feeling combine to produce a behavior. So propaganda is designed to give you a cognition, elicit a feeling, and then push a behavior in a particular direction. So that's the goal of propaganda. Okay. So some examples. We're going to go straight to the most obvious and plain one, because prejudice is a lot of what we base propaganda on. Prejudice is an attitude, and there are a number of different isms that we can talk about here. Racism, of course, is the one that always pops to the top, but we can also talk about ageism, we can talk about sexism, we can talk about anti-LGBTQ. I have to always stop and think that one through to get all the initials in there. We can think about those kinds of isms, and we can talk and we can start to think about how we can use those attitudes, the cognitions and the affect, to push behaviors in a certain direction. Now, I know these slides are really, really wordy, but we're going to post copies of them, and I'm going to give you handouts of them so that you'll have all this information, but I want to get through it, so we're going to do kind of a flyby. Okay, so how do we express those isms? Okay, a couple of different ways. We could do the subtle isms, okay, which would be defense of our traditional values, exaggeration of cultural differences, and denial of positive emotions. We don't get out and protest over these things, but we have those. They're in the background, and we kind of keep it on the down low, as opposed to these guys who are blatant and expressive and active in terms of acting out on their attitudes. Okay, now the problem. A lot of these isms are based in social identities. Who you are at any particular time, and social identities will vary with the roles that you are occupying at any particular time. Some social identities are based on master statuses. So a master status would be something that we can look over this room and we can see a variety of them. They're there. For example, I see black faces and white faces, I see brown faces, I see males, I see females, I see people who are older like me and younger like a lot of you. These things are very obvious. You don't have to look too deeply to find them. And so, but recognizing these identities tends to emphasize the otherness of whoever is not in our group. So here we're talking about some of the stuff you saw up on the posters with respect to what Tajfel was working on. The minimal group paradigm indicates to us that it doesn't take very much in order for you to create an identity of our group and their group. We can activate that very, very easily. Okay. So, I'm going to show you some images here, and these images may be a little bit disturbing to most of us, I think. But they are examples of how we can use fears to motivate behavior. So these are really interesting, I thought. This one says, is your washroom breeding Bolsheviks? Obviously from the McCarthy era, and goes on to discuss about how if you are using rough paper towels in your bathroom, you're breeding discontent among your employees, and of course, then that's going to turn them into communists eventually by the Scott tissue towel makers. Okay. How and what to tell a communist is this other. Now, I think this guy probably made quite a nice side income by posing for these Bolshevik posters. But how and what to tell a communist is also an advertising. This one is the Tinker Roller Bearing Company. So if you happen to be sitting next to a communist at your coffee break, here's what you explain to the communist. I'm on to you. I know what you're about. I'm going to report you, and you'll be thrown out of the country. Okay. So obviously, in the workplace, there was a lot of concern about communism. Okay. Stereotypes and propaganda are also used to effect social control on a population. Beneath this picture, it says, feminism encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. Okay? This is cited to a U.S. politician who I will not name, but he's a rather conservative individual, obviously. Okay. The quote that you see there is something that was recently published on Breitbart. So we can see that this whole women's movement, feminism issue is really an attempt to destroy the male half of the population, and it's dangerous. And yes, Dr. Rowley's going, yeah, you have to be very, very careful around those women because, we're dangerous creatures. All right. We also use stereotypes to justify our aggression against people who are not like us. We are the in-group. Anybody who's not like us is the out-group, according to Shashtel. So these are some very, very disturbing images. Okay? But these are not new. We've got to have somebody to blame. We need somebody to scapegoat for all our problems. And if we can blame a group and start producing negative images of that group, then it makes it easy for us to aggress against that group. These are propaganda from World War II, obviously. And as I said, some of these are very, very disturbing images, but they are images that were put together from a variety of different areas. Obviously, this is United States. This one is United States. That one on the one of I think Eisenhower, I think that is Russian. And this one down below is Chinese. And all of them depict enemy situations where, of course, we were fighting with Hitler, so we've got the slaughtered women and bloody babies. The Japanese, of course, after Pearl Harbor, were always depicted as people who were sneaky and rats, and there's some very virulent anti-Japanese propaganda out there. This one from Japan is depicting soldiers throwing Japanese babies into a well. Okay, here's another one. Women, again, are problematic for a variety of reasons, but we elicit fear and distrust using propaganda. So we're talking here about don't go overseas and start picking up women, because if you do, you're going to come home with something you don't want. Okay? So be careful. A bag of trouble. Don't pick up women. Booby trap, which is termed, and a juke joint sniper. This one over here is an example of a leaflet campaign, and the Germans used to print these things out and fly over and drop them on the troops that were on the ground, so that they would attempt to discourage and terrify people. Now, what you may not be able to see, it's not very clear, is that this is targeted at British troops. And the gist of the argument is, while you are laying dead on the front, there is an American back in Britain who's sleeping with your woman. And so they used to do all kinds of these things. I have a couple of instances where they are depicting black soldiers who are happily eating in a barracks doorway, encouraging them to surrender, because if you surrender to the German troops, of course you'll be housed and fed and warmly clothed, and they're going to take really, really good care of you in the prison camp. So that was also a leaflet campaign. Okay, now I'm going to bring this up to modern day, and we're going to talk a little bit about something that's been going on now for the past month, 6 months or so, that's been well publicized. We're going to talk about the Dakota pipeline issue and how people are representing themselves, or how the players in this issue are portraying themselves and demonizing the other side so that we can win supporters one way or another. So it's a tale of two discourses with two very opposing sides talking about the same issue from the perspective of the individual groups. So, Energy Transfer is the company that is funding or trying to put in the Dakota Access Pipeline. This is how they are represented. Okay, this is who they are, as opposed to the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and all of the other people who are coming in to support that group. So activists, military veterans, other parties, a large crowd of people gathering to fight against the pipeline. So let's look at how the two players are representing this issue. Okay, so here's what they're doing. It's an 1,172-mile pipeline transferring crude oil. You're going to see a map here in a minute to depict the route of this pipeline. And the ultimate goal is that we're going to open the pipeline and we're going to be transporting 470,000 to 570,000 barrels of oil through this pipeline per day. So in order to do this, they've had to go and get easements, they've had to access privately owned lands, and lands that impact the sovereign Native American nations and others. Okay, so while the pipeline is not crossing the reservation, it's running up against the reservation, and part of the issue is that the bulldozers are bulldozing the graves of their ancestors. So while they're not reservation lands, they are in fact holy lands to the people who are protesting the pipeline. All right, so here's the discourse. This is Energy Transfer's way of discussing the pipeline. I want you to look very, very carefully about the route of this pipeline, and I want you to tell me, just shout out, what do you observe about this map? Not going through Minnesota. Okay, might nudge up against Wisconsin. So the pipeline, of course, goes from here up to over here. What else do you see?
Don't the tar sands start in Canada?
I don't know the answer to that, but the stars represent wellheads. Okay, so that's what those are. Any straight line. Okay, look harder. What do you see? Really use your critical thinking and your powers of observation. Will, Dr. Riley.
Kind of privileging cities and highways and so on. It's going mostly through rural, fairly poor states. I don't know if that's what you're getting at.
No. Anybody else? I mean, one more. Yes.
The colors are kind of happy and bright.
Yeah. Chandler got it. The colors. Look at the colors that are represented here. We've got, pretty green stars, and here's where they start. And who thinks of green and oil? Anybody? No, probably not. With these pretty pink, squares that indicate the areas where this pipeline is going to pass through, and it kind of reminds me a little bit, of a unicorn fart. There we've got the pink dust and the green stars. Okay, looks pretty benign, right? I'm sorry.
He said unicorn part, I had to say squatty potty.
Okay, so here's what Energy Transfer has to say about this. This is a great thing. It's pink, it's benign. Millions in state and local revenues, 156 million in sales and income taxes generated through this pipeline. Okay, it's $3.7 billion investment into the infrastructure. Okay, we are impacting the local and national labor force by creating 8,000 to 12,000 construction jobs and 40 permanent operating jobs. Okay. We've already created historically high shipment ratios of crude, so we're, those green stars were the Bakken oil fields where the pipelines are, or the wellheads are. Okay, so we're increasing our production. The pipeline will meet or exceed state and federal safety requirements, and minimum will be designed in accordance with 49 Code of Federal Regulations. Okay, that's what Energy Transfer says. Sounds like a good deal. Okay, but there's a Q&A on their website as well. By the way, what if I don't want them on my property? Well, you know, you may have to get the court to intervene, and you may have to pay the legal fees for that. So a little bit of a scare tactic going on. What happens if we can't agree on an easement? We're going to sue you, and we're going to take your land. If you read the fine print, of course, put in a less confrontive way. Okay. Now let's look at the other side, the discourse for the Standing Rock tribe. Okay. Note the black snake in Sioux country. Kind of different from that trail of pink stuff and stars. Okay. So here you see an attempt to portray the pipeline in two different ways. Okay, the people who have a lot to gain from it are portraying it as benign, helpful, going to create jobs, improve the infrastructure. Okay, we've got a different point of view coming from the tribes people who are calling it the black snake. Okay, here's the protesters' side of it. Okay. We are really, really tired of people taking our lands and violating our treaties, okay? Lands and resources have been taken without regard for the tribe. The government has broken multiple treaties with us, and here we go again, okay? Not only in 1868, but in 1958, they took our riverfront forests and all the good land that was providing for our tribe. They took it and they left us with the garbage land instead. Okay. Now, here they come again. They're taking our clean water and our sacred places. The tribes have always paid the price for America's prosperity. So, they have a long-standing grievance, and this is just yet another issue with the tribes. And now, we bring a social identity in. Okay. Protecting the water and our sacred places has always been the center of our cause. Facing the destruction of homelands and waters, the tribes were ignored previously, and they continue to be ignored when we're trying to deal with these issues. What's more, our cause is just for a variety of reasons. Okay, we've got ranchers and farmers who are living downstream. We're not the only people who stand to lose if this pipeline comes through and then there's a spill. How many spills have there been in this century alone? Anybody know? A bunch. Calvin? Oh no, more than that. Yeah, lots more. These things happen all the time, and remember the Deepwater Horizon, the BP oil rig. So these things do happen. As American citizens, they argue, we have a responsibility to speak for the future that's safe and productive. We are a peaceful people, yet the Lieutenant Governor has threatened to use his power to end this historic peaceful gathering. And finally, our songs and prayers, now we're going to a different place. Another identity, the identity of protectors and people who are very spiritual in their nature. Our songs and prayers echo. We're standing up for our rights, And we're protectors, we're doing so on behalf of the millions of Americans who will be affected by this pipeline. So, two very, very different discourses in which we are constructing different identities. Where we're demonizing the pipeline as the black snake, and we are constructing an identity for ourselves as protectors, as people who are keepers of the sacred trust. Okay, so just to summarize, here are the themes. For energy transfer, we've got state and local revenues, all the things that you see here. Sales, creation of the jobs, easier access to oil, financial gain, but maybe if you don't play with us, you get a lawsuit. For the Standing Rock tribe, they take care of the tribal lands and resources. We have been victims before, we are becoming victims again. Our sacred places are not respected, we're destroying national resources. Our tribe is persecuted and voiceless. We have no power, you have done this to us before. Okay? So, where is the justice? We're citizens and we're conducting a peaceful protest. Two very different types of discourse approaches. Okay. So, with respect to discursive psychology, discourse is how we act, and it's used in terms of creating power. So, discourse constitutes our reality, our realities, and it helps shape our perceptions of the world that we live in and the people who live around us. We use, when we're creating discourses, we use recurring metaphors, we use stereotypes, we use things that are cognitive shortcuts in order to give power and imagery to our discourse. Okay? And so people are situated by their discourse. I can change my identity just by changing the person who I am standing in front of you. Today I'm talking, I'm a speaker. As soon as I go over and sit down over there, I'm a member of the audience. I take on different roles. Okay? And that's how easy it is to change your identity. And that perhaps is why you are seeing some of the radicalization of young men who are radicalizing themselves into extremist groups and planning and taking on those identities. Okay. So, discourse is how we accomplish action. So what do we do about this radicalization, and how can we act in ways that help people not to become radicalized, not to take on those identities? Okay? Let's go back to the Dakota Pipeline for just a minute. Okay, we need to engage the stakeholders. If you want somebody to come with you, you need to involve all the parties that are involved. You need to bring stakeholders to the table and discuss and acknowledge the different perspectives that people have about this. Okay? If you are negotiating, use that discourse. Identify possible objections to your position and acknowledge them. And come in with that acknowledgement. And people will believe that they will be heard. That they have been heard. Okay? And finally, when you're in discourse, okay, listen carefully to the other side of the argument. Hear what the individuals are saying. Hear the discourse and hear the identities that they are acting from in order to respond properly. Reflect back what you hear and listen mindfully to them with the intent to understand what they're actually saying before you come back with a response. If people feel as though they are heard, as though they have a voice, as though they are not marginalized, people will be less likely to radicalize. Any questions? Yes?
Just that last one, I would go back though and say that that is exactly how people who are trying to radicalize you, that is their recruitment cycle.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
I mean, the exact same thing can be to radicalize or de-radicalize.
That's absolutely correct. It's the same kind of process. Because when you're doing a persuasive argument, you want people to act the way you want them, to move them in the direction that you want to go. Yes?
So if this internal discourse is what's creating self-radicalization, how do we find the external markers that will allow us to identify those individuals and proceed with an anti-radicalization?
That's a really complicated and interesting question that really involves perhaps the actions of observers. And the unfortunate problem with that is people who are internally radicalizing, there may be signs. For example, they may begin to isolate themselves. They may change the people that they're affiliating with. But the Columbine shooters, the school shooters, they were doing all this stuff, and their parents had no idea. I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer was doing what he did. His parents had no idea. So it's really challenging to recognize that slow movement toward radicalization.
Yeah, I think outside of people who are mentally sick
Mhm.
and normal people who have the tendency to become radicalized, you have to look at their, how they perceive, how they see the outside world is not just. I mean, that feeling of something is not just, something is not there, and that seeing the dehumanization of their tribe,
Yes.
or the people that they, the people that they feel belong with, the people that they identify with, the culture that they identify with. When they see the dehumanization of that culture, so those are the things that inside the human being, because none of us, I mean, we are all born as an innocent baby, right? So what happens that, someone becomes radicalized and someone doesn't. So I think that plays a big role. And when you look at the people who are radicalized in Europe, especially in France or England, you have to see the neighborhoods they live in, and how isolated they are, and how they're not playing any role in the function of the society. So I think these are all the external conditions that make someone to get to that point. That and besides, this is a war of people who have no power. That's how they fight. I just want to comment that often in the process of radicalization or extremist behavior, that the idea of marginalization, the idea that we're pushing people for some reason to the fringes of our society is really important, because one of the things, when we think about the Columbine school shooting, for example, you ask yourself, what was wrong with those kids? What happened? How did they get this way? But one of the things that really struck me, they were doing interviews with kids who had survived that shooting, and they were asking them questions about the shooters. And one of the guys, who was one of the football players and a really popular guy in school, they asked him, well, what arose was the idea that they were bullied and they were ostracized. They were odd, they didn't fit in. And so they were asked by the news reporter, well, why, and the kid said, people used to call him names and bully him a little bit. And the reporter said, well, why? Why would they do that? And the kid said, well, they kind of deserved it. So, and that stuck with me for all these years. They kind of deserved being bullied and ostracized. And so they turned around and took revenge. But Often people who are radicalized or who are brought into groups are seeking for something. Internally, they're missing something in their lives. And so the discourse that is provided to them by the recruiters fills a need of some kind. So it's important to start recognizing what those needs may be.
Yes, I believe that the inclusion of all aspects of the different cultures in society is a major part to going forward. And somebody wasn't invited to the drawing board, somebody wasn't invited to the table. There was some things that were left out, so therefore they're on the outside. Whoever's on the outside of that deal will always feel left out. And it has continued to happen, and it's going to continue to happen until it's fully addressed by everyone. And then you got to say, well, the people that don't want everybody to be included, then if everybody else says, well, you're the only ones that don't, then they're pushed out. So it's really tough, and it's so multifaceted with the culture here in our country because it's such a diverse melting pot. But we have the tools and the ability to conquer it. I absolutely believe that.
This is a really, really complex issue, and obviously, what we say here in the short time that we have today doesn't begin to cover the complexity, as Mike was pointing out earlier. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask you to briefly mention how complicated this makes it for mental health professionals and frontline law enforcement. Several examples we've looked at today, people exhibiting crazy behavior, but they came and talked to people. The people didn't see the trigger, they didn't see what was coming. So what kind of challenges do you think that puts people on the front lines with people that are about to radicalize?
I think that one of the more important things we're going to see arising in our education, especially for people in law enforcement teaching, is the idea of cultural competency and learning how to recognize those differences and how to respond in a way that does not marginalize people or take away their power and their voice. Recognizing those differences will go a long way to allowing us to have better relations between, for example, Black Lives Matters and the police. There's a reason why this stuff is going on, and that reason is real. If we are able to talk about and discuss and help, say for example, law enforcement to recognize that it's an interaction whereby people are, if you pull somebody over in a car and it's a Black person who steps out, they're coming into this interaction already having expectations for the police. So if you are aware that just by your body movements, you could be eliciting a response that you are not desiring, or understanding, from the other side, that if you respond in a certain way to the police are trained to respond a certain way back to you. Having those very clear understandings involved in the training would be, I think, really, really helpful. Okay. My stage manager says wrap it up back there. Let's move forward now, and we will work on the question and answer, and then we're going to distribute the workshop materials as we're going on. So, for any of the other panelists, and who has questions, and is there anything that anyone would like to add or express? Okay, do the panelists have any comments? I'm going to just pass it around to the panelists now.
Well, the people I've been dealing with, there's not much room for dialogue, which is what you're talking about, to get beyond just hurling the propaganda. But I do have some questions from some of my colleagues here in terms of, let's say, vetting applicants for visas. And there's a dispute on how well it's going, but the people involved say it may take up to 3 years from certain areas. So what kinds of questions can you ask of people who might possibly be inclined towards terrorism? And I think of this in terms of the assassins back in the 13th century. They were adept at insinuating themselves in ruling households, and even for years appearing as faithful servants, and then at the right time they would assassinate the leader there. So I mean, that's one extreme of a committed terrorist who could completely deceive everyone. But if we're talking about somebody who sees something on the internet and gets all excited, or somebody from some war-ravaged area, so I'm asking my colleagues who dealt with this, are there certain kinds of questions that you could ask, and repeated questions, so there might be some likelihood of drawing something out for these types of people? I think the Israelis seem to be pretty good at this in dealing with airport security.
To kind of piggyback off of that, I made mention about the lack of empirical research on terrorists. And if you think about it, and you think about how research is conducted, you go up and you ask somebody, depending, quantitative, qualitative. Yeah, you're not going to go, hey, can I come into your group and ask you a bunch of questions that I'm later going to publish for the world to see? You're probably going to end up on a YouTube video. Not a good one. So that is why we don't know a whole lot. It's just because, not only that, a majority of researchers, if we say, hey, we're going to take you to a hostile environment and ask you to go in and interview or talk to possible terrorists, do you want to sign up to do this? I don't think you're going to have very many takers. So.
Can you hear me? Yeah, this was the issue before. Okay, I think that the question is what, and this is from my perspective in political science, where we try to do this as empirically as possible. The question would be, how do you get someone to give you answers that would be useful in terms of showing some external markers that might indicate that you're a risky individual? And as both of my colleagues pointed out kind of wittily, you're not going to ask someone, are you a terrorist? And get them to say yes. A couple of things I've seen people do are provide some kind of psychological screening that tests for example, extreme PTSD, other mental issues that might lead to an attack or some kind of hostile behavior down the road. There are also, and I'd have to look up the name of the author of this, but there are a number of studies of people from Eastern Europe and the former communist world and from the Islamic world where they ask questions like, be honest, do you think that, for example, suicide bombing is ever justified when fighting, for example, I believe the language was a hostile and imperialist power? And I think Ivan, actually, who's in the room, thanks, John, but I think Ivan, actually, who's in the room, has some data about this on one of his posters. If you ask people from a number of, as it happens, Muslim majority countries, but a number of countries around the world, do you believe that violence against the elite or against the rich can ever be justified? Suicide bombing, sniping? It's about 38 or 39%. I think someone who answered yes to that question, you might not want to let in as an immigrant. So I think that there are a number of ways to profile. I also think bluntly, I mean, the biggest problem here is legal and moral issues. So when we looked through John's data, 9 out of 10 people, everyone that was a terror suspect was male. And I think that's going to be the key variable for crime. By the way, crime is to some extent a gender issue. 96% of criminals are men. But everyone was male, everyone was under 35. 8 out of 10 were Muslim and members of fairly radical groups. 2 were Christian and members of fairly radical groups. I would say that male, young, religious devotees from poor countries are a fairly risky immigrant pool. The question is whether you want to acknowledge that or say America is the exceptional nation and we'll do what we can with those who come here. But I think that at root, and I say, by the way, that is what we should do, but at root, that is a moral question. It's not an empirical question at all. So that's up to kind of the souls and the opinions of our citizens. That's really all I have to add there. You can't ask someone, are you a terrorist, and get the answer, sure thing. So this comes up, by the way, often in this field. Who packed your bags? No one's going to say ISIS. So that's really all I have here.
If you look at all the terror acts that have happened during the past few years, starting from 9/11. 9/11, granted, these were all foreigners from Saudi and Yemen who came here, and they were not citizens, right? But put that aside, the rest of the terrorists, majority of them are, these are homegrown terrorists. I mean, they are citizens of France, citizens of Belgium, even citizens of United States who have done the act of terror. I mean, have you, do you have the data of how many of these terror acts were committed by refugees or people who just, got a visa and entered the country?
I think I could actually answer that.
So that, and I'm sure I'm just screwing up all over the place with the microphone here, but that is an important point. Very little terrorism in the United States is committed by refugees or by first-generation immigrants, so thanks for pointing that out. Immigrants of essentially every racial group I've looked at, you can't obviously say African Americans, so it's from Nigeria, but black immigrants, white immigrants, Hispanic immigrants, all of these immigrant groups have a much lower crime rate than black, white, and Hispanic Americans. All three of whom have very high crime rates, by the way, globally, although for whatever reason Asian Americans do not. But I don't think that necessarily changes the profile. When I said the profile perhaps for a suspect in the traditional sort of terror, the truck explodes, would be a young, male, Muslim or perhaps Christian religious devotee, I think that probably would be true. I think that describes the Pulse shooter, the San Bernardino shooter. All these people fit that very narrow profile. The Ohio State attacker was in fact a Somali refugee, but had been here for some time. The issue is that these people were born in the United States. But what we find is that second-generation immigrants have a fairly high crime rate. It's a hint of the American norm. And there are a couple of possible explanations for that. One would be racism. People feel ostracized in a new society. Another would be the development of oppositional cultures, which is something we see among youths of every variety, including those who speak the native language perfectly. But if you were simply going to say, there is a group that commits acts of terrorism, that group would be 97% male, with a few the Black Widow sort of exceptions. Muslim, and to only a slightly lesser extent, Christian religious extremism, I think would motivate a great deal of that. There is very rarely an atheist act of terror. Buddhist rebels struck from the hinterlands. Young men commit almost all crime, and by extension, young men commit almost all acts of terror. I'm not sure I'd want to take the profile much beyond that. But that is something to keep in mind if you're looking at individuals entering the country or who's going to be involved in gang violence or something like that. But good point, first-generation immigrants commit much less crime than we do. The United States is not one of the least violent societies in the world. But the question with some groups would be, what will happen in the second generation?
Okay, anybody else got comments or questions?
Yeah, I have one. You said it a couple of times now that you're associating terrorism with states that are poor, low on the economic factor. Actually, you said it like 3 times.
Okay, no, just to clarify, my profile for a terrorist would be young, under 35, male, Muslim, or to some extent Christian religious extremist. I think that there often is an association of terrorism with poverty. I don't think that's true if you look at the 9/11 hijackers and so on. So no, I mean, if I mentioned that in passing, no, that wouldn't be something that I would look for necessarily.
Okay, you've said it 3 times, so that's why I wanted to push back on you. The data actually is out there. The correlation is actually extremely weak. It's an R of only 0.18 between GDP and GTI and GDP and terrorism.
So there's a positive correlation of 0.18.
But it's a very small one.
Yeah, it's not quite statistically
Yeah.
significant. So I think we're agreed. There's a correlation, but not a
It's a
Now, between male and terrorism or the other things I said, huge. But yeah, good point.
I have a question point.
Let me just add that historically, the tendency is for the leaders of the radical revolutions to be somewhat educated. I mean, Baghdadi has a PhD in theology. Lenin was educated. Stalin at least went to the seminary for a while. Pol Pot was an engineer, graduate from Sorbonne. And middling kind of leaders to be somewhat educated, like the 9/11 hijackers. But usually, traditionally in these revolutions, the mass of followers are from the margins of society. 10, like in 1534, they were landless peasants and laborers without jobs. In the Third Reich, the biggest supporters were Hitler, the lower middle class, who were almost destroyed by World War I and the Weimar Republic. So there's a whole range of people in terms of education, but there tends to be the educated part tends to be skewed towards the top.
All right, any other comments, questions, rebuttals, debates? Okay.
I mean, an entirely new problem now is technology. I mean, ISIS is doing it. Joseph Goebbels would have been completely out of his mind if he saw what ISIS has to do with the internet, which is spreading things throughout the world right now. And of course, you have to be able to read to do that. So there's a whole new dimension that's just building up right now.
Would you say that terrorists fit the profile of other soldiers, just out of curiosity, or the general description has? And that was just my question for you. Really, last comment for me. My question for the first presenter was simply, would you say that terrorists fit the profile of other soldiers or militiamen, where the general might be an educated, true believer, and then you have a great deal of, for want of a better word, cannon fodder? Because there's a pretty standing profile for soldiers. I don't know if you apply that to terror actors.
I would say that analogy holds a great deal. And I didn't get into the details here, but you also have a whole range of moderate revolutionaries who kind of want to go to some extent, but they don't want to go all the way. And eventually, like in the French Revolution, the Girondists and the sans-culottes will get executed. So there's a whole continuum here that we can get into.
Okay, if there are no other questions or comments, John's got one? Or we...
I had a question for Dr. Riley. You made mention of declared wars, and obviously we know a lot about them because they were declared. So if we look at the undeclared conflicts, which are obviously, we really can't put a number on that. I don't know if in your research, if you made comment of that or thought about it in any way, shape, or form?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of different ways to look at that. I'm sure by this point the audience is pretty tired of me being on a microphone. But that's why I look at three variables to some extent, John. And I think you get into the question of what military level violence is. So I mean, the rate of murders in Chicago last year alone was, as I recall, 715. And that's more people that have died in a number of military conflicts. So they're not quite at the level of a war, not 1,000. That would be counted, in my field at least, as common crime. So that falls into the homicide rate. Then I look at the list of wars, and the list of wars includes any conflict, declared or undeclared, with more than 1,000 deaths. So I guess what I'd be doing there is treating as an insurgency anything that's within a country, all the belligerents are from that country. There's quite often been no declaration of anything. Las Zapatistas or the Shining Path pretty much just came down from the hills and started fighting. So I would distinguish that, and you're going up a ladder, and of course there's going to be a little blurring at the edges of each step of that ladder. But you're going up from there all the way to recognize international conflict, 1,000+ deaths, to national state-level belligerents. And again, I do, in terms of declared war, most of those conflicts on step 3 are declared. But again, the United States hasn't declared war, full, legal, international war, since World War II. So I think the key thing there is the presence of multiple states and the number of deaths. I don't think we did in Korea, UN actions, World War II. Thank you.
I'm not sure what I could we make of this, but it's interesting that we no longer have a War Department since World War II. We have a Defense Department, so we don't go to war. The War Powers Act that gave the President defined powers to engage in military action probably also contributed to this phenomenon.
And I'm going to say that there's some discourse for you right there. We no longer have a War Department, but we have a Defense Department. And it's our job, I was pointing out, Dr. Collier was pointing out a little bit earlier, we have a job to keep the peace around the world. So we're not a War Department, but we're a Defense Department now, but we still carry guns. So I'm going to take the mic back now. If there are any other comments from the audience or any questions? Okay. Let's move on to the next little part of this. We're going to break for our afternoon break here in just a minute. But before we do, I wanted to go over what you have in the packets that were handed out to you here a few minutes ago. This is your afternoon's activity. So what we would like you to do is to take the information that you've learned today. So you've got copies of the presentations, that the 4 speakers' presentations, and then the poster presenters also have handouts of their posters that they can give. And what we would like you to do is the following. I would like you to do a little presentation from your groups. This is a group project. And use the PowerPoint that has been distributed among those of you who have computers in order to get this job done. So, your first slide will be your presentation title. So here's the target group that you're going to do. What I would like you to do is to actually, I'm sorry? Oh, okay, hold on, I'll get there. Okay, so let me give you the goal. The goal is for you to create a propaganda poster that is based on the information that you learn and an image that is representative of the action of that group. So, on the PowerPoint that's on the packet that's on the top, where it starts with your presentation title, those are actually the slides for your presentation that you're going to do on PowerPoint if you've got access to PowerPoint. Okay? I would like you all to identify a group from the second pile from the second packet in your file, which describes a variety of different extremist groups, and then there are numbered slides following that actually gives some background information on certain groups. And there's a variety there. I try not to go with anybody that anybody's too familiar with, but we have some eco-terrorists, and we have some some religious groups, and we have your garden variety white supremacist or neo-Nazi type groups in there. So there's a variety of different groups and philosophies that you can look at and select for your group to do the presentation on. Do a little bit of research on the group, figure out who they are, how your group would be categorized in terms of the different orientations that are at the beginning of that packet. And then be prepared to discuss and describe what it is their mission is and what do they stand for or against. You know, in the case of eco-terrorists, it might be standing against something, or certainly Standing Rock would be against something. So be able to identify those. The next slide talks about the contextual factors in current events. So why are they there? What is the purpose of this group? Okay, what are the conditions that may be marginalizing them? Okay, if you're missing something, come and see me. What actions might the group take under the current conditions? Okay, so if you belong to Black Lives Matters, what actions might you take given current circumstances? Okay, who's going to join your group? Who's your target person? Who do you want to recruit? Okay. And finally, based on all of those things, create your little propaganda poster using imagery and a strong slogan to invite people to come in and perform the action that you want them to perform. So what we need is people to break up so that there's a computer where each group can work and can access the internet in order to get what they need. Do a little bit of research about your group. And at your table, select one of the groups on your list. And then get together and discuss and come up with the answer to these questions. We're going to do that for, let's see. We'll figure out how many groups that we have, and at the end, I want you all to report out. So pick a spokesperson for your particular group. Yeah, I see this going on over here. She's the girl, so we're going to pick her. And so pick somebody to come up, bring your PowerPoint up, and then report out and show us the PowerPoint slide that you've got. Any questions? Questions? Okay. As we begin, feel free to go over. They're setting up a really nice break for us over there, so feel free to get your refreshments. Come back, work in a group, and I'm going to walk around and answer questions for you if you have them, and then we will report out probably about, let's plan for 3:30. We'll begin the report outs.
So we are on Traditional Values Coalition, which focuses on like conservative Christian values. So this is our front slide. This is like the ideal American family according to the Tradition Value Coalition. Yeah. So our background information and history of the group Kim's going to talk about.
Okay, you said he would talk, and then I would skip the slides. I didn't write it.
Okay, so the American Conservative Christian Organization believes in Bible-based tradition values, explicitly like the Old Testament traditions. So like marriage between a man and a woman, anti-birth control, everything like that. It's mainly a lobbying group for a more conservative Congress, so in their current state they would be considered a happy group considering the majority of legislature and the executive branch is conservative. Additionally, the traditional values, they fight for the right to life, patriotism, opposition to homosexuality, pornography, and the teachings of evolution in public schools, and illegal immigration as well. They're not a very large group though. We looked into their history, and like last year they only raised $40,000 for lobbying efforts. Their purpose is to promote religious liberty in a conservative manner. They haven't done anything radical yet. They have considered a fully conservative Congress a win, as I stated earlier. And then for their membership profile, their target member is an older white conservative, mainly because younger conservatives have more moderate social beliefs. And like I said, they have strong religious beliefs. So people who are annoyed with the civil rights movement would be individuals that this group would target to join. Pro-white groups, and then traditional marriage and values, and they don't support anything else. For a propaganda campaign, and you guys noticed we kind of made this whole presentation of propaganda campaign, the audio in the background. They want, their kind of like slogan is, if you want an American family, so do we, but just the right one. So they only envision the proper American family as like the first slide that we had. They believe that traditional values are being attacked in this nation and that you need to help by becoming an activist today. And then they especially play on cognitive biases of traditional conservatives to gain activism, and that's their main way to gain members. And then this is kind of like our propaganda slide that we focused on. So this top left image, this is a picture of the devil depicting evolution. That's the modern family homosexual couple, and they hate that. And then that's the devil holding birth control, because if you use it in their mind, you're going to go to hell. And so this is what is killing America, and that's what they believe. And then we put their logo over here, which is the Traditional Values Coalition. It's just the top of the Capitol with the little star below it. And then this is a meme that we thought was appropriate. It said, Republican Jesus guarding America from the liberals, and he's kind of, and I think that was it. You guys have any questions? Traditional Values Coalition?
All right, good job, guys.
started in 1992, and their mission is to attack any organization or business that's making profit off the earth and plundering natural resources or destroying the environment or anything like that. They want to educate people on the atrocities committed against the environment. They destroy luxury homes, SUVs, private property, and commercial property to try to stop any sort of environmental destruction. One of their main methods is to use arson. One person started 20 fires that did $40 million worth of damage, and another person started 2 fires that she had to pay $6 million in restitution. So yeah, they set fires at construction sites. They try to destroy equipment or just do anything to stop the progress of anyone who's destroying any sort of environmental thing. People that would join this group are excessively radical liberal activists who see the earth as being a victim of environmental degradation. Any sort of victims of fracking or oil spills, like people in Flint, Michigan, who don't have like crazy sulfur water or whatever coming out of their taps. Anyone who feels like the earth might be a victim, or anyone who wants to take radical steps in order to sustain the earth and keep everything alive. Steps we would take to things that we would put in our environmental campaign is establishing like an environmental in-group of people that like want to protect the world and save the world versus like a big business out-group that want to profit off the environment and taking down trees and environmental quality. Our propaganda would show charts, graphs, environmental changes of the earth over time, such as temperature, climate change, charts and stuff like that. Actions we want to get out of our propaganda is people to recycle or protest, just be involved in changing the environment, and our propaganda would awaken anger, determination, feelings of victimization along with the world. And this is what we came up with for our poster. I feel like it's pretty minimalistic, but it kind of shows a businessman with the world in his hands and just a very simple, direct statement to take it back. What do we got?
All right. Team effort. We got it. All right, there we go. So we have a fictional group. It's not real, loosely modeled off of the group Anonymous, but with an economic bend to it. So steal from the rich, give to the poor. Who are we? Obviously, geeks, people with computer skills, not me. Typically loners, people who don't like to socialize outside of their home environment or a place where they're very comfortable. Individuals who have a sense of grievance in that they came from a broken home or had a troubled childhood. Typically younger people, mid-30s is the upper range, but anywhere from 15 all the way up to 35. People who have been previously abused, individuals who are familiar with the dark web and who socialize on the dark web, and who feel that justice is on the side of the poor, that there's some sort of issue with systemic poverty in their environment. What's their mission? To redistribute wealth from the disenfranchised to the poor. What are they for? The poor. What are they against? The rich. Contextual factors, they exist because of increasing inequality in the income spectrum. There's no kind of end to the tunnel. So, you get on the hamster wheel and in the rat race, and you keep working and working and working, and you never get anywhere. And there's a real sense that there's broken promises within society, that some people are benefiting because of societal systems, and other people are always the losers. These are also individuals who are isolated from their local family place where they do feel emboldened, where their cyber skills make them special. It's a society where there's a high unemployment rate, particularly among young men. Again, a general sense of hopelessness, particularly with we have nothing to lose. There's nothing holding them back anymore. Also that the government is not doing enough. They're not living up to their end of the bargain in the social contract. What actions would they take? We delineated it between two major categories. There's cyber crime on one hand, and there's cyber terror on the other. Those of you who do have some specialization in the world of digital warfare know that that's a really sticky gray area, and there's still a lot of legal, ethical, theoretical things to work out before we really figure them out. But we do have things like ransomware, DDoS attacks, which are distributed denial of service, spyware and blackmail, theft and vandalism do lean very clearly towards the crime aspect, whereas things like taking control of water, power plants, hijacking planes, hijacking military assets, like for instance the F-35, the new fighter jet, or other civic systems would be along the terrorism side. There is, however, a middle ground where you can do, the action may be a crime on a small scale, like vandalism or like a DDoS attack, but if it has a large impact, so if it shuts down a transportation system for an extended period of time, if it shuts down financial markets for more than a day, if it interrupts the food system or the water system, then you sort of get in that gray area where it moves between being a crime into an act of terrorism or act of war. But a lot of that really depends on the motive. Was it a teenager whose attack got out of control because they released a virus into the wild and they didn't know what would happen, versus someone who had a strategic action and effect they wanted to achieve? See, our membership profile, typically male. That's just the way it is with cyber. It's really hard to get females into that. We don't know why it attracts males, but it just does. Again, under 35, computer literate, access to the internet. We didn't write that up there, but that's a major factor, especially if you're looking from the global lens instead of just the local one. Anti-authoritarian attitude. They identify with the Robin Hood mythology, the sense of heroism. They think that they're doing something good for society and that their cause is typically just. What are their techniques? We came up with a pretty specific one for this. One of my teammates had this idea. It was actually a really good one. Using computer games, designing a specific game wherein the playing game not only indoctrinates the player to your ideology, but also introduces them to other people with whom they would identify. So that's the behavior. We want them to meet online. We want them to first participate in minor attacks, and then eventually, as the indoctrination proceeds, they would participate in major attacks. The cognitions that we want from them are thinking of past examples of when, well, we have abused before, we want to trigger that sort of thought cycle, and then also trigger a savior complex or a heroism paradigm in them. And then our propaganda poster. Any questions?
For all that don't know me, my name is Sheila Foster, and my group and I, we picked Animal Liberation Front, ALF. So who is the Animal Liberation Front? They carry out like acting against animals, rescue animals, and the people who exploit animals, they'll try to cause financial loss and property damage. And the mission for them, they plan to eventually allocate resources and rescue animals and stuff in the world. So they'll do it to recover money and the people who use them for property that's not, they don't think that's how everyone should be treated. So it says why owl, because that. So people who are animal lovers and people who think we should like stop like animal testing and using puppy mills and mounds. See them as they are victims and that they should be
here. But we decided we're part of ELF, the Earth Liberation Front. And despite the name, which could be kind of construed as fictional, we want to make sure everyone understands that we're not just a movie. And so as far as who we are, we're a radical environmentalist, eco-terrorism group, and we're not sad to say that. And we say that because it's our mission to help the environment at all costs. Well, and I should stepping outside of the program too. ELF of the past is different than the ELF of the present, because it used to be that ELF used to actually engage in some pretty serious eco-terrorism, property destruction, and environmental damage, despite the fact that they were trying to help the earth. So when we looked into present ELF, it didn't quite match up with the way I remembered it being from long ago, because I had to look into them at some other time. But the mission is to help the environment at all costs. And so we're certainly there for protecting the environment using any means necessary. And so as far as why we exist, it's strictly to protect the environment, and again at all costs. So we're using issues of environmental and social justice to try to give voice to those people who feel like they're being taken advantage of, usually by industry and big business, big farms, if anyone's familiar with factory farms, or CAFOs, combined animal feeding operations. And so as far as how we address these threats to our organization and to the earth, it's attack, attack, attack. I mean, of course, there is going to be some propaganda. I'll kind of hit that momentarily. And it's attempting to destroy property, assets of companies and such. So it's just a matter of trying to, at almost any cost, try to take out whatever that threat is to the environment. Because the earth is the mother, and we're defending mom. So as far as who we try to recruit or to have join our group, it's anyone who feels socially disadvantaged and victimized through environmental exploitation. And the idea is, of course, is that the propaganda routine is that you are being robbed of your resources. And so this is how you can become empowered to make sure you can keep what's yours. As far as who we want in our ranks, I don't know if anyone's familiar with most environmental organizations, but predominantly it's white, middle class people, generally educated, and so that's probably who's going to end up coming into our ranks. And but certainly passionate about the environment, seeing that the environment is a resource for all, and not just to be there to be exploited. So as far as how we would go about recruiting folks, we would essentially use guerrilla marketing campaigns with videos showing how the earth is being exploited. So for example, we could show the Gulfwater Horizon platform leaking and on fire, Exxon Valdez footage. Even though the Dakota Access Pipeline isn't complete, demonstrations of pipeline spills. There's Cancer Alley in Cincinnati. The population clusters of cancer, people with cancer due to waste, say near El Paso and near, or down in Louisiana, there's concentrations of waste disposal sites that send people tend to also have high cancer rates due to proximity and such. So showing those kind of things, showing that everyone is essentially potentially a victim, and that you can stand up and resist that. And one other item as far as a propaganda campaign, I forgot to mention this to the group, but a piece of literature that would be great to hand out is The Monkey Ranch Gang by Edward Behaviors are machine is supposed to produce. When we show our propaganda, we're not only going to show what's happening to make people victims, it's what other organization members have done in response. So crippling bulldozers, destroying infrastructure. It's usually a lot of destruction, but it has to be a success story. So letting people see how it's done successfully. And so certainly we want people to be angry and take ownership, or feel that they can take ownership and feel empowered in doing something like this, and wanting to resist being exploited and having your resources taken. Again, protecting mom. So as far as our propaganda campaign, again, the Monkey Wrench Gang was the name of the book. And so whenever you're messing with industry, you're monkey wrenching, so the wrench figures prominently. And this is the actual image for the Earth Liberation Front North America office, I guess you can say. And we wanted to show how oil tends to figure prominently in resource exploitation, but how we're going to really pay for it. And then, of course, have to have some comic effect in there. But, you know, lying aside from the comedy, it's a really big gun. It may be a pop gun, but... and this is actual media produced regarding a movie that relates to deforestation and such. And of course, we wanted a really positivist message saying that, you know, it doesn't matter what everyone else says, we're going to win. We got our little fist of power sprayed all over the side of the construction site. And then just as a joke, because one of the people who was in our group at the time thought that this was going to be this, but we decided to turn this into our fundraising campaign. For anyone who wants to donate to the program, you can get a page out of an adult coloring book, 100% recycled, and when you're done, please recycle. Any questions on our presentation?
Thank you. We came up with kind of like the running joke. Do you remember the old song, "When I Want to Learn Flying Purple People Ears"? Purple people are the kids. So, here we are. The greatest band to ever hate a group of people. What is our mission? To propagate hate against the purple people, the perps. What are we for or against? For the eradication of the perps against perps. Why do we exist? We exist solely to hate perps. What actions must we take under the current conditions, putting out anti-perp music and anti-perp propaganda, such as My Purple People Here, which is also our greatest hit. So, who would join this group? Anyone and everyone who hates perps and wants to create music to spread the hate of perps. What personal characteristics would you expect? 2 eyes, no horns, no wings, not purple, member of our group, or not martial legs, unlike perps. So, what techniques would you use to attract them? The rad 90s pop and rock tunes, which is the Flying Purple Recruiter. Fear of perps, people's fear of monsters, and the unknown. So just facts about purple people. It's the primary color for Barney. Purple is considered the color of death and mourning in UK, Italy, Thailand, and Brazil, and not a common flag color. It's also the color of pollution. So, do you really want this monstrosity in your hometown? You're flying in our windows and eating people. Thank you.
That wraps up our activities and our workshop for the day. I want to thank all of you who participated in the workshop. who have traveled a long way today to come and be with us here at Kentucky State. We hope that you will take food and drinks to go home with. We got lots over there still. And if there are any questions, comments at this point?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Good. Mike, do you have any closing, Dr. Carter?
No, just watch some emails for our colloquium in April. And any of you are thinking of applying for scholarships and grants, the due date is 1 March for the application. And then on 8 March, we're going to meet and give away the money.
All right. Any other questions about that? Money is good. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Eat, drink, travel home safely.
Enjoy.